Namaste, dear viewers. I'm Malini. Welcome to our Discovering Sanatan Dharma series, where we talk to people who were not born Hindu but converted to it later in their lives. There are more than 2 billion Christians in the world. Every year, countless people convert to Christianity, but occasionally, the journey goes in the opposite direction. Today's story is one of those journeys. This is the story of a woman who grew up in Houston, Texas, a woman raised in church, a woman who loved Christianity, a woman who never imagined she would leave it. If you had met her at 16 years old, you probably would have described her as a committed Christian. She attended church, she prayed, she read the Bible, she believed. And if someone had told her that one day she would be studying Sanskrit, visiting Hindu temples, reading ancient Hindu scriptures, and eventually calling herself Hindu, she would have laughed. Not because she hated Hinduism, but because Hinduism seemed so distant from her life that the idea felt impossible. Yet that is exactly what happened. But this wasn't a story of rebellion, it wasn't a story of anger, and it wasn't a story of somebody abandoning God. In fact, it was the opposite. The deeper she searched for God, the further that search unexpectedly led her. It began with questions. Questions that many believers quietly struggle with but rarely discuss openly. Questions about salvation, questions about truth, questions about the fate of billions of people born into different cultures and different religions. Those questions eventually led her somewhere unexpected, not to atheism, not to agnosticism, but to the ancient spiritual traditions of her ancestors. For more than a year, she immersed herself in the world of Neo Paganism. She studied Norse myths, ancient European traditions, the sacredness of nature, the spiritual worldview that existed before Christianity transformed Europe. And for a time, she thought she had found what she was looking for. But eventually, she discovered something missing. The traditions she loved existed mostly in fragments, pieces, echoes, reconstruction, and that realization would change everything. Because during a college yoga class, a casual conversation introduced her to an entirely different world. A world she thought she already understood. A world she would soon discover she knew almost nothing about. The world of Hinduism. That curiosity led her into Sanskrit, one of the oldest surviving Indo European languages on earth. A language that preserved texts, ideas, prayers, philosophies, and spiritual traditions stretching back thousands of years. And what began as academic curiosity slowly became something much deeper. The more she studied, the more she found herself asking a surprising question. What if some of the ancient wisdom she had been searching for in Europe had survived more completely in India? What followed was a journey through philosophy, language, scripture, community, and spirituality. A journey that challenged everything she thought she knew about religion, everything she thought she knew about God, and everything she thought she knew about herself. Today, for the first time, she shares that story in full. This is Sarah's journey, from Christianity, through Neo-Paganism, to Hinduism. Sarah, before we talk about Hinduism, before we talk about Neo-Paganism, before we talk about Sanskrit and temples and philosophy, I want to start at the beginning. Who was Sarah Williams growing up in Houston? When people hear that someone converted from Christianity to Hinduism, many assume there must have been some crisis, some rebellion, some rejection of faith. So tell us about that young girl. Who were you before this journey began?
Namaste, Malini. I am so glad to be here. I have been looking forward to this conversation. Honestly, I was probably the last person anyone would have expected to become Hindu. I was born and raised in Houston, Texas. My parents were Christians. Not just culturally Christian, but genuinely committed believers. Church wasn't something we attended occasionally. Church was part of our life. Sunday mornings revolved around church. Wednesday nights often revolved around church. Vacation Bible school, Christmas services, Easter celebrations, youth groups, Bible studies, all of it. Some of my earliest memories are sitting next to my mother in a church pew, holding a children's Bible, and trying very hard to understand stories that felt larger than life. I remember hearing about Noah, Moses, David, Jesus, and I loved those stories. I wasn't sitting there secretly doubting everything. I wasn't looking for a way out. I believed. I prayed. I wanted to be a good Christian. In many ways, my faith was sincere. Looking back, that's something I always want people to understand. My journey didn't begin because I stopped caring about God. It began because I cared deeply about God. There is a difference, a very important difference.
What was Houston like during that period of your life? Because Houston is one of the most diverse cities in America. Did that diversity affect you growing up?
Not at first. And that's actually one of the ironies of my story. Houston is incredibly diverse. You have people from all over the world living there. Different religions, different cultures, different languages, different traditions. Growing up, I was surrounded by that diversity physically, but not necessarily intellectually. I knew Hindu kids in school, I knew Indian families existed, I saw temples occasionally. I remember driving past large Hindu temples and wondering what happened inside them, but those communities were still mostly outside my world. I never sat down and had deep conversations with practicing Hindus. I never attended a Hindu celebration. I never read Hindu scripture. I never heard Hinduism explained by Hindus. And that's important, because most of my understanding of Hinduism came from Christian sources.
What did you think Hinduism was?
I'm embarrassed to say this now, but honestly, a stereotype. That's the simplest answer. I thought Hinduism was polytheism. I thought Hindus worshipped many gods. I thought idols were literally believed to be gods. I thought Hinduism was largely mythology and ritual. I thought Christianity was unique because it offered a personal relationship with God, while other religions were mostly human attempts to reach God. These weren't conclusions I arrived at through study, they were assumptions I inherited. And I never really questioned them. Because why would I? When you're raised inside a particular worldview, that worldview feels like reality itself. You don't wake up every morning evaluating whether gravity exists. You simply assume it does. That's how Christianity felt to me. It wasn't merely a belief system. It was the lens through which I interpreted everything. Good and evil, truth and error, God and humanity. Everything.
So at that point, did you consider yourself a strong Christian?
Yes, very much so. And I know that's hard for some people to believe now, because once somebody changes religions, people often rewrite the past. They assume you must never have truly believed. But that's not how it was for me. I genuinely believed. I prayed regularly. I read the Bible. I attended church willingly. I defended Christianity in conversations. I wasn't secretly looking for another religion. In fact, if someone had approached me in high school and said, "One day you'll become Hindu," I probably would have thought they were crazy. Not because I hated Hindus, but because Hinduism felt unimaginably distant from my life. It felt foreign. It felt unrelated to my world. There was absolutely nothing in my mind suggesting I was heading in that direction. Nothing.
What was your understanding of truth back then?
Very simple. Christianity was true. Other religions were mistaken. Some might contain fragments of truth, some might contain moral wisdom, but Christianity possessed the complete truth. That's what I believed. And I don't think I was unusual. Most religious people begin there. If you're born Christian, Christianity feels self-evidently true. If you're born Muslim, Islam often feels self-evidently true. If you're born Hindu, Hinduism often feels self-evidently true. I hadn't yet developed the ability to step outside my inherited framework and ask a difficult question. If I had been born somewhere else, would I believe something completely different? At that stage of my life, I wasn't asking questions like that. I was simply living inside the worldview I had inherited. And I was comfortable there. Happy even.
Looking back now, years later, what do you think that young girl was searching for?
That's an emotional question. Because when I look back, I don't see a future convert. I see a young woman sincerely trying to find God. That's all. I wasn't searching for Hinduism. I wasn't searching for another religion. I wasn't searching for rebellion. I was searching for truth. I wanted to understand God. I wanted to understand why we exist. I wanted to understand what happens after death. I wanted to understand how to live a meaningful life. The questions themselves were actually very traditional religious questions. What changed later wasn't the questions. The questions stayed the same. What changed were the answers. But at that moment in my life, sitting in church pews in Houston, singing worship songs beside my family, I genuinely believed that the path I was walking would be the path I would walk forever. And if you had told me that one day I would study Sanskrit, read Hindu scriptures, visit temples, and eventually call myself Hindu, I wouldn't have believed you. Not for a second. Because at that point, that entire future was still invisible to me.
Sarah, you described yourself as a sincere Christian. You weren't rebelling. You weren't looking for another religion. You weren't searching for a way out. So let's talk about the moment things began to change. Can you remember the first time you encountered a question that genuinely shook your confidence?
I can, Malini. Very clearly, actually. And what surprises people is that it wasn't a historical question. It wasn't science, it wasn't archaeology, it wasn't evolution. It wasn't even another religion. It was a moral question. A very simple moral question. A question that sounds innocent until you really sit with it. And once I asked it honestly, I could never completely put it back in the box. The question was this: what happens to good people who are born into other religions? At first, that sounds like a basic question. Christians ask it all the time. Pastors answer it all the time. But for some reason, one day, the question became real for me. It stopped being theoretical. It stopped being an apologetics exercise. It became personal. And that changed everything.
What made it become personal?
College, without question. Growing up, most of the people I knew were culturally similar to me. Then I went to college, and suddenly my world became much larger. I met international students. I met people from different countries, different religions, different cultures, different languages. And something happened. I started forming friendships. Real friendships. Not abstract categories, not labels, human beings. I remember meeting a girl whose family was Hindu. She was kind, intelligent, compassionate, generous, the sort of person anyone would be lucky to have as a friend. And I remember having this strange realization. If I had been born into her family instead of mine, I probably would have believed exactly what she believed. That thought hit me like a truck, because I had always assumed my beliefs were primarily the result of reasoning. But suddenly, I realized how much of religion is inherited. Where you're born, who your parents are, what stories you hear as a child, what language you speak, what community surrounds you. All of these things shape belief. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it.
So what did Christianity tell you about your Hindu friend?
Well, that depended on who you asked. A tiny minority of Christians would say God judges people according to the light they've received. But almost everyone else would say salvation required explicit faith in Christ. And unless my friend accepted Christ, she was headed for an eternity in hell. Some clever Christians would give more nuanced answers. But no matter how sophisticated the explanation became, I kept running into the same emotional problem. The implications. Because eventually, every explanation seemed to lead back to a difficult conclusion. If Christianity alone possessed the fullness of saving truth, then billions of people throughout history would have been born outside that truth. Not because they rejected it, simply because they were born elsewhere. And that bothered me. Deeply. I remember lying awake at night thinking about it. Not because I wanted Christianity to be false, quite the opposite. I desperately wanted an answer that would allow me to keep believing exactly as I always had. But every answer felt incomplete.
Can you give an example? What sort of thoughts were going through your mind?
I remember imagining children, not philosophers, not theologians, children. A little girl born in India, a little boy born in Thailand, a family living in rural China, a village in Africa. Places where Christianity might not even be part of daily life. And I kept asking myself, would God really judge them differently because of where they happened to be born? That question haunted me, because I couldn't escape a simple fact. Nobody chooses the circumstances of their birth. Nobody chooses their parents. Nobody chooses the culture they inherit. Nobody chooses the stories they're told as children. Yet religion seemed deeply influenced by all of those things. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became.
Did you talk to pastors about this?
Many times. And I want to be fair, most pastors genuinely tried to answer. They weren't dismissive, they cared. But I noticed something. The answers often felt like defenses of a system rather than solutions to the problem. I would ask, what happens to someone who never hears about Christ? And the answer would eventually circle back toward theological principles. Original sin, divine justice, human depravity, God's sovereignty. And intellectually, I understood the framework. But emotionally, I still struggled, because none of it changed the reality that billions of people seemed excluded by circumstances beyond their control. And I couldn't reconcile that with the God I love.
Was this the beginning of your doubts?
Not exactly. I think people imagine doubt as a sudden collapse. For me, it was more like a tiny crack appearing in a wall. The wall was still standing. The structure was still intact, but the crack existed. And once you see a crack, you start noticing other things. You start asking other questions. You become aware of tensions you previously ignored. The question wasn't destroying my faith, at least not yet, but it was changing the way I thought. For the first time in my life, I was looking beyond the boundaries of my inherited worldview, and I didn't even realize I was doing it.
What do you mean by that?
I had spent my entire life asking religious questions, but always assuming Christianity was true. I had never seriously asked why people believe different things. Those are very different questions. One asks about doctrine, the other asks about humanity. And once I began thinking about humanity, I became curious. How did other civilizations understand God? How did other cultures understand morality? How did other traditions explain existence? Those questions weren't replacing Christianity, not yet, but they were opening doors, and every door led to another door, and another, and another, until eventually I found myself exploring worlds I never imagined I would explore.
Looking back now, do you think this question was really about religion? Or was it about something deeper?
That's a beautiful question, Malini. Because honestly, I think it was about compassion. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I wasn't trying to prove Christianity wrong. I was trying to understand how a loving God relates to humanity. All of humanity. Not just one tribe, not just one nation, not just one religion. Humanity. And once that became the question, everything changed. Because now I wasn't merely asking, is my religion true? I was asking, how does truth reveal itself across the human family? That question would eventually lead me through Neo Paganism, through Sanskrit, through Hindu philosophy, through temples, through entirely new ways of understanding God. But at that moment, I couldn't see any of that. I was still sitting in a college dorm room, still calling myself Christian, still praying, still believing, still hoping someone would give me an answer that made everything fit together again. I had no idea that this one question, this one simple question, would eventually change the course of my entire life.
Sarah, you described this growing question about humanity, truth, and whether God could really be limited to a single religious path. You said that question opened doors. So what was the first door you walked through?
Oddly enough, history. Malini. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to leave Christianity. What happened was much slower. The more I thought about religion, the more I became curious about something I had never really considered before. My ancestors. Growing up Christian, I had a very simple understanding of religious history. People were pagan, then Christianity arrived, then people became Christian. That was basically the story. But once I started reading history for myself, I realized how much more complicated that story actually was. Entire civilizations had existed before Christianity. Entire spiritual worlds had existed before Christianity. Entire cultures had developed sophisticated ways of understanding life, death, morality, fate, meaning, and the sacred. And suddenly, I found myself asking a strange question. What did my ancestors believe before they were Christian? Not because I wanted to become whatever they were. I was simply curious. It felt like discovering an entire chapter of history that nobody had ever encouraged me to explore. And once I started exploring, I couldn't stop.
What did you find?
At first, stories, myths, legends, the things most people dismiss. But as I kept reading, something changed. I stopped seeing myths as primitive fairy tales. I started seeing them as symbolic attempts to understand reality. I read Norse myths, Greek myths, Celtic traditions, ancient European cosmologies. And what struck me wasn't whether every story was literally true. What struck me was what these cultures were trying to communicate. Questions about courage, questions about sacrifice, questions about wisdom, questions about fate, questions about humanity's relationship to the natural world. The more I read, the more I realized these people weren't stupid. They weren't simply superstitious. They were wrestling with many of the same questions human beings still wrestle with today, just through different symbols and stories. And that realization was surprisingly powerful.
Was there a particular idea that affected you?
Yes, the sacredness of nature. That was probably the biggest shift. Growing up Christian, I had certainly appreciated nature. I believed God created nature, but there was a difference. In many of the traditions I was studying, nature wasn't merely something created. Nature was saturated with meaning. The changing seasons mattered. The cycles of life mattered. The forests mattered. The rivers mattered. The earth itself carried spiritual significance. I remember one specific moment. I was hiking alone one autumn afternoon. Nothing extraordinary happened, no mystical vision, no supernatural experience. But I remember stopping and looking around. The leaves, the wind, the silence, the changing season. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of wonder that was difficult to describe. Not because I believed there were spirits hiding behind every tree, but because I suddenly felt connected to something larger than myself. The world felt alive again, and that experience stayed with me.
Is this where Neo Paganism enters the story?
Yes, slowly. I didn't join a group overnight. I didn't suddenly declare myself neo-pagan. It happened gradually. The more I studied ancient traditions, the more I encountered people trying to revive them. People interested in Norse spirituality, Celtic spirituality, ancient European traditions, seasonal observances, nature-centered practices. And honestly, I found them fascinating. Because unlike many religious communities I had experienced, there was an openness to questioning. People discussed mythology, psychology, history, symbolism, comparative religion. Nobody seemed afraid of difficult questions. That was refreshing. Very refreshing.
What specifically attracted you?
Freedom. Intellectual freedom. I had spent years inside a framework where certain conclusions were already established. Certain answers were expected. Certain beliefs were non-negotiable. Suddenly, I found myself in conversations where people were exploring ideas rather than defending doctrines. That was exciting, and it changed the way I thought. For the first time, I stopped asking which religion is right and started asking what truths might different religions preserve. That shift was enormous. It fundamentally changed how I approached spirituality. Instead of viewing religions as competitors fighting over a single prize, I began wondering whether different traditions might illuminate different aspects of reality. That idea felt both liberating and terrifying, because once you start thinking that way, it becomes difficult to return to a strictly exclusive worldview.
Did neo-paganism give you what you were looking for?
For a while, yes, and I want to be honest about that, because sometimes conversion stories oversimplify earlier stages. Neo-paganism genuinely helped me. It helped me reconnect with wonder. It helped me reconnect with history. It helped me reconnect with questions I didn't even know I was asking. It taught me that mythology could carry wisdom. It taught me that nature could be spiritually meaningful. It taught me that human beings have searched for transcendence in countless ways across history. Most importantly, it taught me humility. I stopped assuming my civilization possessed all wisdom. I stopped assuming my religion possessed all insight. I became a student again, and that was healthy, very healthy.
But eventually something changed, because you didn't stay there. What happened?
That's where my story becomes interesting. At first, I couldn't identify what was bothering me. Everything looked good from the outside. I was learning, growing, exploring, yet there was a strange feeling I couldn't shake, a feeling that something was missing. The best way I can describe it is this. I felt like I was standing in the ruins of a great cathedral. The beauty was still visible, the architecture was still visible, the grandeur was still visible, but parts of it were missing. Large parts. And the deeper I studied, the more I realized why. Many neo-pagan traditions are reconstruction projects. They're trying to rebuild ancient spiritual systems from surviving fragments. From myths, archaeology, historical records, linguistic evidence, folklore, and I deeply respected that effort. But eventually I found myself asking, what would it be like to encounter an ancient tradition that never disappeared? A tradition where the rituals were still alive, the teachers were still alive, the language was still alive, the philosophy was still alive, the community was still alive. I wasn't looking for India. I wasn't looking for Hinduism. I didn't even know enough about Hinduism to look for it. But I had begun searching for continuity. And looking back now, that search was already pointing me towards something I couldn't yet see. Something waiting just beyond the horizon.
Did you have any idea where that search would eventually lead?
None. Honestly, none. At that point, I still thought my journey would remain somewhere within the world of European traditions. I thought I was exploring my past. I thought I was rediscovering ancestral roots. I had no idea that a casual decision, a college yoga class I almost didn't take, was about to change the direction of my life forever. And if there is a moment where the next chapter truly begins, that yoga class is probably it.
Now that is interesting, because so many people in America encounter yoga. Most never become interested in Hinduism. Most don't become interested in Sanskrit. Most don't become interested in Indian philosophy. So, what made this experience different?
Yeah, strange, huh? At first, it wasn't different at all. That's the funny part. People hear my story and imagine that I walked into this yoga class and immediately had some life-changing spiritual experience. That isn't what happened. The truth is much more ordinary. I took the class because I needed an elective. That's it. I was stressed. I was carrying a full academic schedule. I spent a lot of time reading and studying. Yoga sounded relaxing. That was literally my thought process. Nothing spiritual, nothing profound, just stress management. If someone had told me then that this class would eventually change the direction of my life, I would have laughed.
So, when did it become more than exercise?
Gradually. Very gradually. The instructor was an Indian woman. She was warm, intelligent, very grounded. And unlike many yoga instructors I had encountered before, she occasionally discussed the philosophical roots of yoga. Not in a preachy way, not in a religious way, just naturally. She would mention concepts like mindfulness, awareness, discipline, self-observation, the relationship between thought and suffering. And I remember being surprised, because what she was describing sounded much deeper than what I thought yoga was. Up until that point, yoga had always been presented to me as stretching with spiritual decorations attached. But she spoke about it as part of a much larger worldview, and that intrigued me.
Do you remember the first conversation you had with her?
Very clearly. One day after class, I stayed behind. Most of the students had already left, and I asked a simple question. I don't even remember the exact wording. Something like, where do these ideas come from? And that led to a conversation that lasted almost an hour. She started talking about yoga as a path of self-transformation, not exercise, transformation. She spoke about the mind, about attachment, about suffering, about discipline, about awareness, about the search for truth. And I remember sitting there thinking, this doesn't sound anything like what I was taught Hinduism was. Not even close. Because the Hinduism I had imagined was mostly ritual, mostly mythology, mostly gods and temples. Yet here was someone discussing consciousness with a level of sophistication that rivaled some of the philosophy courses I was taking. That genuinely surprised me.
Was this your first serious encounter with a practicing Hindu?
The first serious encounter where I actually listened. That's probably the best way to say it. I had met Hindus before, many of them. Houston has a large Hindu community. I had Hindu classmates growing up. I had interacted with Hindus throughout my life. But this was different. This was the first time I was hearing Hindu ideas explained by someone who actually lived them. And that's important, because many of my assumptions about Hinduism came from people who weren't Hindu. Now I was hearing the tradition speak for itself, and what I heard was very different from what I expected.
Can you give an example? What specifically challenged your assumptions?
Sure. One conversation stands out. I asked her something about karma. At that point, I thought karma meant, what goes around comes around. That's how most Americans use the word. Almost like cosmic revenge. You do something bad happens to you. End of story. But she explained it very differently. She described karma as a law of cause and effect operating throughout life. Not punishment, not reward, consequence. The idea that actions shape character, choices shape consciousness, habits shape destiny. And suddenly the concept became much more sophisticated. Then we discussed Dharma, another word I thought I understood. And once again, I realized I didn't. She wasn't describing blind obedience to rules. She was describing alignment, responsibility, purpose, the obligations we owe to ourselves, to others, and to the world around us. I left that conversation feeling like I had opened a door into a library and discovered there were thousands of books inside. Books I didn't even know existed.
Did you immediately start studying Hinduism?
Not immediately, but curiosity had definitely been awakened. The thing about curiosity is that once it takes hold, it rarely stays confined. One question becomes 3 questions. 3 questions become 10. 10 become 100. I started reading introductory books, watching lectures, listening to discussions, trying to understand basic concepts. And the more I learned, the more puzzled I became. Because Hinduism didn't fit neatly into any category I already had. It wasn't what Christians had described. But it also wasn't what secular critics described. It seemed simultaneously philosophical and devotional, ancient and modern, intellectual and spiritual, diverse yet somehow connected. The more I learned, the less simplistic my understanding became.
Was there a moment where you realized your previous assumptions had been wrong?
Yes, actually several, but one moment stands out. I remember reading a discussion about the nature of ultimate reality, and I encountered the idea that the various deities in Hindu traditions could be understood as manifestations, aspects, or approaches to a deeper ultimate reality. Now, I'm not saying every Hindu explains it that way. Hinduism is incredibly diverse. But that idea shocked me, because I had been taught to think of Hinduism as simple polytheism, many separate gods competing with one another. The reality was far more nuanced, far more philosophical, far more complex. And suddenly, I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years holding opinions about a tradition I had never seriously studied. That realization humbled me. A lot.
What happened next?
The conversations continued. The reading continued. The questions continued. But then another unexpected thing happened. I started meeting more Hindus. Friends of friends, students, families, professors, community members, and every interaction reinforced the same lesson. The reality was far more sophisticated than the stereotype. I met engineers, physicians, researchers, business owners, professors, people who were intellectually accomplished, yet also deeply connected to their traditions. That challenged another assumption I didn't even realize I had. I had unconsciously viewed religion and intellectual rigor as being somewhat opposed, but many of the Hindus I met embodied both, and that made me pay attention.
Looking back now, was the yoga class really about yoga, or was something deeper happening?
Much, much deeper. The yoga class wasn't important because it taught me yoga. The yoga class was important because it introduced me to a civilization, a living civilization. Until then, most of my exploration had focused on traditions preserved in fragments, ancient traditions reconstructed from history. Now I was encountering something different, an ancient tradition that was still alive, still evolving, still teaching, still producing thinkers, still producing communities, still producing spiritual seekers. And for the first time, I began wondering whether the answers I had been searching for might exist somewhere completely outside the boundaries of my own cultural inheritance. That thought was both exciting and terrifying, because once you allow yourself to genuinely learn from another civilization, you never come back unchanged. And without realizing it, I had already begun changing. The girl who walked into that yoga class looking for stress relief was slowly becoming someone else. Someone asking entirely new questions. Someone standing at the threshold of a world she had never imagined entering. And the doorway into that world, strangely enough, was about to be a language. A language older than English, older than Christianity, older than Western civilization itself. A language called Sanskrit.
Sarah, you just said something very interesting. You said the doorway wasn't a temple, it wasn't a guru, it wasn't even a scripture, it was a language, Sanskrit. Now, for most Americans, Sanskrit is something they've maybe heard about but know almost nothing about. How did a girl from Houston suddenly become interested in one of the oldest languages on earth?
Strangely enough, Malini, it started almost accidentally. At that point, I was already spending a lot of time exploring ancient traditions. I had spent years reading about pre-Christian Europe, Norse mythology, Greek mythology, ancient religious systems. I was fascinated by the question of where civilizations came from and how people understood the sacred before the modern world. And somewhere during that process, I encountered the idea of the Indo European Language family. At first, it sounded incredibly academic, the sort of thing only linguistics professors care about. But the more I learned, the more fascinating it became. I discovered that English belongs to the same language family as German. German is related to Dutch. Dutch is related to other European languages. Greek is part of that family. Latin is part of that family. And then I discovered something that completely surprised me. Sanskrit was part of that family too. Not just part of it, one of its oldest surviving members. That absolutely captivated me, because suddenly India didn't feel as distant as it once had. For the first time, I realized that the story of human civilization was far more interconnected than I had imagined.
What fascinated you so much about that?
The age. Malini, the age. The continuity, the preservation. Remember where I was emotionally at this point. I had spent years studying traditions that survived mostly in fragments. Fragments of myths, fragments of rituals, fragments of languages, fragments of ancient worldviews. And suddenly, I was discovering a civilization that had preserved texts thousands of years old. Not reconstructed texts, not guesses, not archaeological fragments, actual texts, actual philosophical conversations, actual prayers, actual debates, actual spiritual traditions. Still being studied, still being recited, still being transmitted. That was astonishing to me. I remember sitting in my dorm room one night reading about Sanskrit literature and feeling almost overwhelmed because for the first time I realized I wasn't looking at ruins. I was looking at continuity. And that was something I had been searching for without fully realizing it.
So what did you do?
I signed up for a Sanskrit course, which still sounds crazy when I say it out loud, because there was absolutely no practical reason for me to do it. It wasn't going to help my career. It wasn't going to improve my resume. Most people had never even heard of the language. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know why this language had survived for so long. I wanted to know what kinds of ideas it contained. And honestly, I wanted to see whether it was really as extraordinary as people claimed. So I enrolled. And that decision ended up changing my life.
What was your first impression?
That it was beautiful. Difficult, but beautiful. There was a precision to it that immediately stood out, even at the beginner level. I remember learning that many Sanskrit terms didn't translate neatly into English, and that fascinated me, because language shapes thought. If a culture develops highly refined vocabulary for certain experiences, that tells you something about what that civilization has spent centuries contemplating. Take a word like Dharma. How do you translate it? Duty? Purpose? Righteousness? Responsibility? Cosmic order? None of those fully capture it. Or karma. Most Americans think they know what karma means. Then you start studying the concept seriously and realize it's far deeper than the popular version. The same thing kept happening over and over. I would encounter a Sanskrit word, think I understood it, then discover layers beneath layers beneath layers. It was like entering a completely different intellectual universe.
Did this remain purely academic, or was something spiritual beginning to happen?
At first, I told myself it was academic. I think that's important to admit, because if you had asked me then whether I was considering becoming Hindu, I would have said no. Absolutely not. I still saw myself primarily as a curious student, a researcher, someone exploring ideas. But something deeper was happening underneath the surface. The more Sanskrit I studied, the more I found myself reading texts, not because someone told me to, because I wanted to. And those texts were unlike anything I had encountered before.
What were you reading?
A little bit of everything. Introductory materials at first, then selections from Hindu scriptures, philosophical texts, commentaries, lectures. The more I read, the more fascinated I became. Because I had expected mythology. What I found instead was philosophy. Deep philosophy. Questions about consciousness, questions about identity, questions about reality, questions about suffering, questions about human purpose, questions about liberation. The kinds of questions philosophers have wrestled with for centuries, but explored with a depth I had never encountered before. And honestly, it was shocking. Not because I agreed with everything, but because I hadn't expected it. The stereotype I inherited simply did not prepare me for the intellectual richness I was discovering.
Can you give an example? A moment where something you read genuinely stopped you in your tracks?
Yes, actually, I remember it vividly. I encountered the idea that the deepest self is not the body, not the personality, not the ego, but something deeper, something enduring, something transcendent. Now, whether someone agrees with that idea or not isn't the point. What struck me was how seriously the question was being examined. This wasn't, believe this because we said so. It was an investigation, an exploration, a philosophical inquiry. The text wasn't demanding obedience. It was inviting contemplation, and I found that incredibly refreshing, because I had spent much of my life searching for certainty. Now I was encountering a tradition that often seemed more interested in understanding. That difference affected me profoundly.
Was there a moment where you realized this was becoming more than intellectual curiosity?
Yes, and it surprised me. One evening, I was sitting alone reading. Nothing dramatic, no mystical experience, no visions, no voices, just reading. And I suddenly realized I wasn't reading these texts the way I read history books. I wasn't reading them as an outsider anymore. I was reading them as someone searching for answers. That realization startled me, because it meant something had changed. The questions that had driven me into Neo Paganism were still there. The questions about truth, meaning, purpose, human destiny. But now I was finding responses that felt deeper than anything I had encountered before. Not necessarily final answers, but deeper answers. And that distinction mattered. A lot.
Earlier, you talked about searching for your ancestors. Did Sanskrit affect that part of your journey too?
Very much. And this is something people sometimes misunderstand. I wasn't trying to become Indian. That was never the goal. What fascinated me was the realization that Sanskrit preserved one of humanity's oldest surviving intellectual traditions, including ideas that emerged from a broader Indo European world. I had spent years searching through fragments of ancient European traditions, and now I was discovering a civilization that had preserved ancient wisdom continuously. That continuity fascinated me, not because it belonged to my ancestors specifically, but because it belonged to humanity. It felt like finding a library that had somehow survived while so many others had been lost. And once I discovered that library, I wanted to explore every shelf.
Looking back now, what did Sanskrit really give you?
Perspective. That's the simplest answer. Perspective. It shattered the assumption that my civilization was the center of human wisdom. It shattered the assumption that profound philosophy belonged exclusively to the West. It shattered the assumption that religion and intellectual rigor were opposites. Most importantly, it made me realize how little I actually knew. And strangely enough, that realization was liberating. Because once you realize how much there is to learn, curiosity replaces certainty. And curiosity is powerful. It takes you places you never expected to go. In my case, it eventually led me toward Hindu scriptures, toward Hindu communities, toward Hindu temples, and toward a question that would become impossible to ignore. A question that emerged every time I studied these traditions. If these ideas were so profound, if these teachings were so sophisticated, if these communities were preserving something so ancient and so alive, then perhaps it was finally time to stop studying Hinduism from a distance. Perhaps it was time to experience it for myself.
Sarah, throughout this journey, we followed you from Christianity to Neo-Paganism, from Neo-Paganism to yoga and Sanskrit, and from Sanskrit into the study of Hindu philosophy. But until now, most of this has happened in books, in classrooms, in conversations. At some point, you actually had to walk into a Hindu temple. Do you remember your first visit?
Oh my God. Malini. I will never forget it. I remember it vividly, as if it was yesterday. And what's funny is that I was nervous. Much more nervous than I expected to be. Today that probably sounds strange, but remember where I was mentally at the time? I was still carrying decades of Christian assumptions. I had read about Hinduism, I had spoken with Hindus, I had studied some Sanskrit, but emotionally, there was still a part of me that viewed a Hindu temple as other, as foreign, as something outside my world. I remember pulling into the parking lot of the Meenakshi temple in Pearland and just sitting in my car for a few minutes, trying to calm myself down. And looking back now, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of the temple, I was afraid of what I might discover there. Because by this point, enough of my assumptions had already fallen apart that I no longer trusted my inherited understanding of Hinduism. And that was unsettling. Very unsettling.
What happened when you walked in?
The first thing that surprised me wasn't theological. It was physical. People were removing their shoes. Now, intellectually, I already knew that, but seeing it was different. Families, children, elderly people, young professionals, everyone removing their shoes before entering. I asked someone why, and the answer was simple. Because this is sacred space. That answer stayed with me, because growing up Christian, church was often described as the house of worship, a place where believers gather. But the explanation I received in the temple was different. Someone said, "This is Devale, the abode of the deity, the home of God, not merely where we come to worship, where the divine resides." And that distinction fascinated me, because immediately I realized I wasn't entering the building with the same assumptions. I wasn't merely entering a religious assembly, I was entering a sacred presence. At least, that's how the people around me understood it, and I wanted to understand why.
What did you notice next?
The sounds. Without question, the sounds. There were bells, chanting, conversations, children laughing, priests reciting Sanskrit. It didn't feel silent. It felt alive. And that surprised me, because I think I unconsciously expected something solemn and rigid. Instead, it felt like entering a sacred home where multiple generations were participating together. Then I heard a bell ring, and I remember asking someone why people rang the bell. The explanation was beautiful. They told me that when you ring the bell, you are announcing your arrival before the divine. You are leaving behind the distractions of ordinary life. You are bringing your awareness into the present moment. Now, whether every Hindu explains it exactly that way isn't the point. The point is what happened in my mind, because suddenly a ritual I might once have dismissed as meaningless had meaning. And I started noticing that pattern over and over. Things I had previously categorized as superstition often had layers of symbolism beneath them. That realization kept happening throughout my entire journey.
What about the Sanskrit? By this point, you had already begun studying it.
And that was probably the most emotional part of the visit. Because for the first time, Sanskrit wasn't sitting inside a textbook. A book cannot tell you how the chant actually sounds when you hear it. The pitch, the meter, the enunciation of certain syllables. Here in the temple, those chants were alive. I remember standing there, listening to the priest's chant, and suddenly recognizing words. Not everything. My Sanskrit was still very limited, but enough. Enough to realize these weren't random sounds. These were ancient prayers, ancient invocations, ancient verses, still being recited, still being preserved, still being transmitted. And I remember feeling goosebumps, because I had spent years studying ancient European traditions where so much had been lost. Fragments remained, stories remained, but continuity had often been broken. Now I was standing inside a living tradition where sacred language had survived. Not merely survived, thrived. And that affected me deeply.
Was there a specific chant that stayed with you?
Yes. I had gone on a Monday, and as you know, that's a special day for Shivji. So the Rudram was being chanted, and it surprised me that I recognized it. Or at least portions of it. I didn't understand everything at the time, not even close. But I remember learning later that these verses had been transmitted for generations with extraordinary care. The precision, the preservation, the oral tradition, the discipline required to maintain it. All of that fascinated me. And it wasn't merely historical curiosity. It was the realization that I was witnessing continuity. The same sacred sounds being recited century after century. That hit me very hard emotionally, because continuity was exactly what I had been searching for, without fully realizing it.
Did that contrast with your experience in Neo Paganism?
Very much, and I say that with respect. Neo Paganism gave me many important insights, but often we were trying to reconstruct, trying to rebuild, trying to infer, trying to recover. Here, I wasn't looking at reconstruction, I was looking at transmission. That difference was enormous. One felt like archaeology, the other felt alive. And I found myself increasingly drawn toward that living continuity.
What about the deity itself, the Murti? Because that's where many Christians struggle.
Absolutely. And I struggled too, let's be honest about that. I walked into the temple carrying decades of assumptions about idolatry. So when I saw people standing before a Murti, offering flowers, bowing respectfully, praying, part of my Christian upbringing immediately reacted. The voice in my head said, "Isn't this exactly what you've been warned about?" That reaction was automatic. Years of conditioning, years of assumptions, years of sermons. But then I started asking questions, and the answers surprised me. Again, people explained that the Murti wasn't viewed as a random stone statue. It was understood as a consecrated form through which the divine becomes accessible to human beings. A focal point, a sacred presence. Now, I wasn't instantly convinced, but I was forced to admit something. The actual belief was far more sophisticated than the caricature I had inherited. And once again, reality turned out to be more complicated than the stereotype.
Was there a particular moment where your assumptions really started breaking down?
Yes, darshan. concept of darshan. That idea fascinated me. As a Christian, I was accustomed to thinking primarily in terms of prayer directed toward God, speaking to God, listening to God, worshiping God. Then I encountered this idea that seeing the deity and being seen by the deity was itself spiritually meaningful. At first, I didn't fully understand it, but the more I reflected on it, the more profound it seemed, because the emphasis wasn't solely on what I was doing. It was also on presence, relationship, encounter. The idea that divine reality is not merely something we think about, it is something we experience, something we enter into. That shifted something inside me.
Did anything else surprise you?
Prasad, without question. I remember receiving prasad and being confused. Someone explained that food had first been offered to the deity and was then shared with the community. And again, I found myself comparing. As Christians, we had communion, sacred bread, sacred wine. But this felt different. The entire act emphasized gratitude, offering, reciprocity, receiving life itself as a gift. And I remember thinking, this religion seems to sacralize everyday life in ways I had never considered. Food becomes sacred. Sound becomes sacred. Space becomes sacred. Time becomes sacred. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. That idea affected me deeply.
When you left the temple that day, what was going through your mind?
Honestly, confusion. But the productive kind of confusion. The kind that happens when reality refuses to fit inside your existing categories. I didn't leave thinking, I'm going to become Hindu. Not at all. But I did leave thinking, I have misunderstood this tradition. That much became impossible to deny. The Hinduism I encountered inside that temple was not the Hinduism I had inherited from stereotypes. It was older, deeper, more sophisticated, more alive. And perhaps most importantly, it was coherent. The rituals connected to the philosophy connected to the community connected to the sacred. Everything seemed woven together into a single living fabric. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I never thought I would ask. Not, why do Hindus believe these things? But, what if there is something here that I need to understand? That question stayed with me long after I left the temple. And the deeper I went, the more difficult it became to ignore. Because the next discoveries would challenge not just my assumptions about Hinduism, they would challenge my assumptions about God, about the soul, about salvation, about human destiny itself.
Sarah, at the end of your first temple visit, you said Hinduism was beginning to challenge your assumptions about God, the soul, salvation, and human destiny. That sounds enormous. So let's take this slowly. What was the first major Hindu idea that collided directly with your Christian worldview?
Rebirth, without question. Rebirth was the first idea that genuinely forced me to stop and rethink everything, because Christianity had given me a very specific map of existence. You are born once, you live once, you die once. Then comes judgment. After that, your eternal destiny is fixed. Heaven or hell, saved or lost, with God or separated from God. That was the framework I had inherited since childhood. So when I encountered the Hindu understanding of rebirth, it wasn't just another interesting religious idea. It was an entirely different vision of existence. It changed the scale of the soul's journey. In Christianity, human life often felt like a single test with eternal consequences. In Hinduism, existence appeared more like a long process of growth, learning, purification, consequence, and eventual liberation. That was a completely different universe. And at first, I didn't know what to do with it.
What specifically made it difficult for you?
The difficulty was that rebirth challenged almost every assumption I carried. As a Christian, I had been taught that each person has one earthly life. That meant this life carried terrifying finality. You had one chance to believe correctly, one chance to accept salvation, one chance to align yourself with God. And if you failed, the consequences could be eternal. So even when Christianity spoke about love, there was always this background pressure, a deadline, a cosmic urgency, a fear. But Hinduism introduced a different picture, not a careless picture, not a picture where actions don't matter, actually the opposite. In Hindu thought, actions matter intensely, but the consequences unfold through karma, through character, through future experience, through the soul's long journey across births. That felt very different from eternal punishment. It felt morally serious, but not morally disproportionate. That distinction mattered to me, deeply.
Explain that. What do you mean by morally serious but not morally disproportionate?
In Christianity, I struggled with the idea that a finite human life could result in infinite punishment. Even if someone made terrible choices, the idea of eternal conscious torment was hard for me to reconcile with justice. But I also didn't want a worldview where actions had no consequences. That would be morally empty. What I found in Hinduism was something different. Karma does not erase responsibility. It intensifies responsibility. Every thought, every action, every habit shapes the person we become. If I act with cruelty, I am not merely breaking a rule. I am deforming my own consciousness. If I act with compassion, discipline, generosity, and truthfulness, I am refining my consciousness. That was powerful, because karma wasn't presented to me as cosmic revenge. It was consequence, moral causality, the universe as morally structured, actions bearing fruit, not because God is arbitrarily angry, but because reality itself is woven with order.
That was a very different way to think.
So karma did not feel like punishment.
Not in the way I had imagined. Before studying Hinduism, I thought karma meant something simplistic. You do something bad happens to you. Almost like the universe is keeping score and striking back. But the more I learned, the more I realized that was a very shallow understanding. Karma is subtler than that. It is not merely external punishment. It is the way action shapes being. It is the way intention leaves an imprint. It is the way repeated choices become tendencies. Tendencies become character. Character shapes destiny. That made immediate sense to me, because I could see it even in ordinary life. A person who lies repeatedly becomes the kind of person for whom lying becomes easier. A person who practices compassion becomes the kind of person for whom compassion becomes natural. A person who feeds anger becomes ruled by anger. A person who disciplines the mind becomes freer from impulse. So karma was not just about what happens after death. It was about what is happening right now. Every day, every choice, every thought, every habit. And that made Hinduism feel extremely practical.
How did rebirth connect to that?
Rebirth gave karma larger horizon. In the Christian world I came from, life was compressed into one lifetime. But Hinduism expanded the timeline. The soul's journey was not limited to 80 or 90 years. The journey could unfold across many births. That didn't make life less important. It made life part of something much larger. It allowed me to think about spiritual growth as gradual. Some souls are spiritually mature. Some are immature. Some are struggling with anger. Some with attachment. Some with ego. Some with ignorance. Some are drawn toward truth. Some are not yet ready. In Christianity, the question often became, are you saved? In Hinduism, the question became, where are you in your journey toward awakening? That difference was enormous, because one framework divides humanity into final categories, saved and unsaved, believer and unbeliever. The other framework sees beings at different stages of development, still responsible, still accountable, but not eternally frozen by one lifetime. That felt more compassionate to me, and also more realistic.
Did this change how you thought about people from other religions?
Completely. This was one of the biggest shifts. In my Christian upbringing, other religions were often viewed through the question of salvation. Had they accepted Christ? Were they saved? Were they lost? Even when Christians were kind, that question was always somewhere in the background. But Hinduism gave me a different way to see people. Not as saved or damned, but as souls. Atman. Spiritual beings moving through different conditions, cultures, temperaments, and levels of understanding. Suddenly, the Hindu girl I had known in college was not a theological problem to be solved. She was a soul on a path. The Buddhist, the Christian, the Muslim, the atheist, the seeker, the confused person, the devoted person. All of them could be understood as beings moving through karma, learning, growing, struggling, evolving. That did something to my heart. It softened something, because I no longer had to look at humanity through a binary of eternal inclusion and eternal exclusion. I could look at humanity through the lens of spiritual journey. And that felt more aligned with compassion.
Where does moksha enter this? Because rebirth alone is not the final goal in Hinduism, correct?
Exactly. And that was another major discovery. At first, I thought rebirth was the central idea, but then I learned that Hinduism does not present endless rebirth as the ultimate goal. Rebirth is part of sansar, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And sansar is not romanticized. It is not treated as paradise. It is a cycle marked by ignorance, desire, attachment, suffering, and temporary pleasures that never fully satisfy. The goal is moksha, liberation, freedom from ignorance, freedom from bondage, freedom from the mistaken identity that says, I am only this body, this ego, this personality, this one little story. That was profound to me, because suddenly salvation was not simply being admitted into heaven, it was awakening to the deepest truth of who we are. That was a very different idea. In Christianity, salvation had been tied primarily to relationship with Christ, forgiveness of sin, and eternal life with God.
In Hinduism, moksha was described as liberation from ignorance and bondage.
A transformation of consciousness. That fascinated me, because it made spirituality not only about what God does for me, but also about what must be purified, understood, and transformed within me.
Did that feel more demanding?
Yes, in some ways, much more demanding. People sometimes imagine Hinduism as easier because it does not always insist on one exclusive belief, but that is misleading. Hinduism may be more open in terms of paths, but it is not spiritually shallow. It asks something very serious of you. It asks you to examine your mind, your desires, your ego, your attachments, your anger, your speech, your habits, your duties, your relationship to the divine. It does not simply ask, what do you believe? It asks, what are you becoming? That question pierced me, because I realized that much of my religious life had been centered on belief identity. Am I in the right religion? Do I affirm the right doctrine? Am I saved? Hinduism kept turning me back toward transformation. Am I truthful? Am I disciplined? Am I compassionate? Am I attached? Am I acting according to Dharma? Am I moving toward liberation, or am I strengthening my bondage? That was not easier. It was deeper.
How did this connect back to the temple experience?
The temple helped me understand that these were not abstract ideas, because once I began seeing the temple through Hindu concepts, everything looked different. The mantra were not just sound. It was part of a discipline of consciousness. The arti was not just waving a lamp. It was an offering of light to the divine, and then receiving that light back as grace. Prasad was not just food. It was food first offered to God and then received with humility. Darshan was not just looking at an image. It was entering into sacred presence. Even bowing was not just cultural behavior. It was a physical act of reducing the ego. And suddenly, I saw something. Hinduism was training the whole person. Body, speech, mind, memory, emotion, intellect, community. It was not only asking me to believe something in my head, it was placing my entire being into a sacred order. That was extremely different from the Christianity I had known. Not because Christianity has no rituals, it does. But in my experience, Christianity had become very belief-centered. Hinduism felt practice-centered, consciousness-centered, and transformation-centered. That difference became impossible to ignore.
Was there a specific scripture that helped you understand this?
The Bhagavad Gita, especially the way Krishna speaks to Arjuna, because Arjuna is not asked to merely believe a doctrine, he is asked to see clearly, to act according to Dharma, to overcome confusion, to discipline the mind, to offer action without attachment, to understand the difference between the eternal self and the temporary body. That was powerful. I remember reading the teaching that the embodied soul passes through childhood, youth, and old age, and similarly passes into another body. That verse shook me, because it presented death not as annihilation and not as a final courtroom, but as transition. The body changes, the self endures. I could not dismiss that. It was too profound, too coherent, too morally serious, too spiritually expansive. It gave me a vocabulary for things I had felt, but never been able to articulate.
Did this make Christianity feel smaller to you?
That is a delicate question. I would not say smaller in a disrespectful way. Christianity had shaped me. It had given me love for God. It had given me moral seriousness. It had given me reverence. So I do not want to speak about it carelessly. But yes, My inherited Christian framework began to feel narrower, not because Christians are narrow as people, but because the theological map I had inherited felt too compressed for the complexity of human existence. One life, one judgment, one exclusive path, one eternal outcome. Hinduism gave me a larger metaphysical landscape, multiple births, karma, dharma, sansar, moksha. Many paths, many temperaments, many stages of spiritual growth. A universe where God was not absent from other cultures. A universe where the soul's journey was vast. Once I saw that landscape, it became very difficult to return to the smaller map.
What was the emotional effect of that realization?
Relief. That is the honest answer. Relief. For years, I had carried a spiritual anxiety I could not name. The fear of being wrong. The fear of people I loved being lost. The fear that billions of human beings were eternally doomed. The fear that God's love was somehow limited by historical access to one religious message. Hinduism did not make life morally easy. It did not say, do whatever you want. It did not remove responsibility. But it removed the terror of eternal exclusion. It replaced that terror with accountability, growth, and liberation. That changed me. Deeply. I began to feel that the universe was not a trap. Life was not a single exam with infinite punishment for failure. Existence was a school, a battlefield, a pilgrimage, a journey. And the divine was not merely waiting at the end to judge me. The divine was present throughout the journey, guiding, sustaining, correcting, awakening. That thought gave me peace, a peace I had not felt in years.
So was this the moment you became Hindu?
No, not yet. But it was the moment the inner balance shifted. Before this, Hinduism was something I was studying. After this, Hinduism became something that was interpreting my life. That is a big difference. I was no longer simply asking, what do Hindus believe? I was asking, what if this explains my questions better than the framework I inherited? And once that question appeared, I could not ignore it, because every new Hindu concept seemed to illuminate an old Christian struggle. Karma answered my longing for moral accountability without eternal disproportionality. Rebirth answered my struggle with unequal birth and inherited religion. Dharma answered my need for moral responsibility beyond mere belief. Moksha answered my longing for liberation, not just forgiveness. And the idea of Atma answered my deepest fear, that I was only a fragile personality waiting to be judged. This was no longer curiosity. This was confrontation. Two worlds were standing before me, and for the first time, I felt that the Hindu world was not merely interesting, it might actually be true.
Sarah, up to this point, Hinduism has been changing your mind. You studied Sanskrit, you read the texts, you visited the temple, you encountered ideas like karma, rebirth, dharma, moksha, darshan, prasad, and the sacred presence of the deity. But there is a difference between studying a religion and practicing it. So when did you stop being an observer? When did Hinduism become something you actually began to do?
That was the hardest step. Much harder than reading. Much harder than attending a temple once. Much harder than saying, this is interesting. Because as long as Hinduism remained something I studied, I could keep a safe distance. I could tell myself I was just intellectually curious. I could say, I'm learning about another tradition. That felt safe, respectable, academic. But practice is different. Practice forces you to ask a more dangerous question. Not, is this fascinating, but, do I believe this enough to enter it? That is where the rubber meets the road. And for me, the first real step came through something very simple. Mantra.
Why mantra? Why not temple worship or scripture?
Because mantra felt like the bridge between everything I had been studying and everything I was beginning to experience. I had encountered Sanskrit in the classroom. I had heard Sanskrit in the temple. But mantra brought Sanskrit into my own breath. That was different. A book can remain outside you. A lecture can remain outside you. Even a temple visit can remain outside you, if you treat it like cultural observation. But when you begin repeating a mantra, the tradition enters your body. Your voice, your rhythm, your attention, your memory, your nervous system. That sounds dramatic, but it is true. The first time I began reciting a mantra seriously, I realized I was no longer just looking at Hinduism. I was allowing Hindu practice to shape me. And that frightened me.
What frightened you?
The old Christian fear. It came back immediately, even after all my study, even after all my doubts, even after everything I had learned. There was still a voice inside me saying, "What if this is wrong? What if this is idolatry? What if you are opening yourself to something dangerous? What if your family was right?" That voice did not disappear overnight. People sometimes imagine conversion as a clean break. It is not. At least, it was not for me. I carried Christianity inside me for years. Its prayers, its fears, its moral instincts, its language, its warnings. So when I first tried to chant a Hindu mantra, I felt torn. One part of me was drawn toward it. Another part of me was afraid of it. That tension was real. Very real.
Do you remember the mantra?
Malini, you are making me emotional now, because the mantra I chanted was very simple and profound at the same time.
Om Namah Shivaya.
I had heard it at the temple. I had seen it in books. Someone explained it to me as a mantra of reverence to Shivji, but even that explanation was new territory for me, because in Christianity, prayer had always been directed to God in a very specific framework. God the Father, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit. Prayer had a familiar architecture. Now I was sitting alone, softly repeating, Namah Shivaya.
Om Namah Shivaya.
Om Namah Shivaya. Gosh, even saying it now is giving me goosebumps. But at that time, I remember thinking, what am I doing? Am I praying? Am I meditating? Am I invoking? Am I crossing a line? That line mattered, because for the first time, I was not merely analyzing Hinduism, I was participating in it.
What did the mantra do to you?
At first, it made me uncomfortable. Not because the mantra itself was harsh, it was actually calming, but because it forced me to confront my own fear. I realized that much of my religious life had been governed by anxiety, fear of the wrong prayer, fear of the wrong belief, fear of offending God, fear of being deceived, fear of crossing an invisible boundary and being spiritually condemned. And as I repeated the mantra, that fear rose to the surface. But then something else happened. The repetition began to quiet me. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually. My mind stopped arguing for a few moments. My breathing slowed. The words became less foreign. The sound began to feel less like an intellectual object and more like a sacred rhythm. And that was powerful, because I had spent years thinking spirituality was primarily about correct belief. Here I was discovering a practice that worked directly on the mind, not by forcing me to sign a statement, not by demanding instant certainty, but by training attention, training presence, training surrender. That was different from anything I had known.
Did you understand the meaning of Om Namah Shivaya at the time?
Only partially then. And that mattered too, because in Christianity, I was used to prayer being linguistically transparent. You generally knew exactly what you were saying, but a Sanskrit mantra functioned differently. Meaning mattered, but sound also mattered. Vibration mattered. Precision mattered. Transmission mattered. That was new to me. I learned that the mantra was not simply a sentence. It was sacred sound, a disciplined form of speech, a way of aligning the mind, a way of invoking presence. And because I had studied Sanskrit, I was fascinated by the fact that these syllables had been preserved with care. Not casually, not randomly, through repetition, through teacher to student, through family, through temple, through oral tradition. That continuity affected me deeply, because I kept comparing it to Neo Paganism. In Neo Paganism, so much had to be reconstructed. Here, the sound itself had been carried forward, generation after generation. That gave the practice a weight I could feel.
How did this contrast with Christian prayer?
Christian prayer, at least in my world, was often spontaneous, personal, verbal. You spoke to God from the heart. And there is beauty in that. I do not want to dismiss it. But the mantra was different. It was not about expressing my personality to God. It was about disciplining my personality before the divine. That distinction changed me. Christian prayer often began with my thoughts, my needs, my emotions, my words. Mantra began with something older than me. I had to enter it. I had to receive it. I had to repeat words I did not invent, words that had shaped countless people before me. That humbled me. because it placed me inside a lineage rather than making my private feelings the center of prayer. And I needed that. I did not know I needed it, but I did.
Did you feel guilty?
Yes, at first, very guilty. There were moments when I would chant for a few minutes and then stop because I felt overwhelmed. I would think about my family, my mother, my childhood church, the hymns I loved, the Bible verses I had memorized, and I would feel almost like I was betraying them. That was one of the most painful parts of the journey, because religious conversion is not just intellectual. It is emotional. It is familial. It is embodied. You are not merely changing beliefs. You are changing memories. You are changing loyalties. You are changing the spiritual language of your childhood. So, yes, I felt guilt. But I also noticed something. The guilt came from fear. The mantra brought peace. And I had to sit with that contrast.
That is a powerful contrast. Explain it more.
The old framework said, if this is not Christian, be afraid. The actual experience said, this practice is making me more peaceful, more disciplined, more aware, more humble. That was hard to ignore, because I had been taught to judge Hindu practices as spiritually dangerous. But when I practiced sincerely, I did not become darker. I did not become immoral. I did not become confused in the way I had been warned. I became calmer, more reflective, more careful with my speech, more aware of my mind, more conscious of my actions. And that created a contradiction. If the practice was evil, why was it producing fruits of peace? That question mattered, because Christianity itself had taught me to evaluate spiritual life by its fruits. And the fruits I was seeing were not fear, arrogance, or chaos. They were humility, discipline, reverence, stillness. That became difficult to dismiss.
Did you begin doing other practices?
Slowly. Very slowly. I began lighting a small lamp. That was another major step. It sounds simple, but for me, it was not simple. Lighting a lamp before prayer felt deeply symbolic. In the temple, I had seen arti, the lamp offered before the deity, the flames circling, the bells ringing, the priest offering light. Then devotees receiving that light with their hands, drawing it toward their eyes and head. At first I thought it was beautiful, but mysterious. Then someone explained that the light represents knowledge, divine presence, the removal of darkness, the offering of the self. That explanation stayed with me. So one evening, alone in my room, I lit a small lamp. No audience, no performance. Just me, a flame, and a prayer I barely understood. But something happened emotionally. The room changed. Or maybe I changed. The act of lighting that lamp told my mind, this moment is sacred. This is not ordinary time. Pay attention. That was very different from the Christianity I had known, where prayer could happen anywhere, anytime, often informally. Again, there is beauty in that, but Hindu practice taught me the importance of consecrated action. The body matters. Gesture matters. Sequence matters. Beauty matters. Sacred attention matters.
Did you create a small altar?
Eventually, yes. And that was another threshold. At first, I resisted the word altar because it felt too intense, too final, too religious. But eventually, I placed a small image of Shivji and a small image of Durga Mata, a clean shelf. Nothing elaborate. A lamp, flowers when I had them, a little bowl for water, sometimes fruit. And I remember staring at it thinking, this would shock my younger self, because growing up Christian, this would have looked like exactly what I had been warned against. Images, offerings, ritual. But by then, my understanding had changed. I was not worshipping paper or stone. I was orienting my mind toward the divine through form. That idea was revolutionary for me, because Christianity had taught me to be suspicious of sacred images. Even though Christians themselves often use crosses, icons, stained glass, paintings of Jesus, nativity scenes, but Hinduism made the sacred image central in a way that was unapologetic. And once I understood murti, consecration, and darshan deeply, I began to see that form was not necessarily an obstacle to God. Form could be a doorway. That realization changed everything.
What about offering food? Did you begin doing that too?
Yes, and that may have been one of the most transformative practices, because offering food changed how I related to ordinary life. At the temple, prasad had already affected me. The idea that food is first offered to the divine and then received back as grace. But doing it at home made it personal. Before eating, I would place a small portion aside. Fruit, rice, something simple. I would offer it mentally. I would pause and then receive it as prasad. Again, from the outside it looks small, but internally it changed everything. Because the practice taught me that life is not mine first. Food is not mine first. Even breath is not mine first. Everything is received. Everything is sustained. Everything should be offered back. That was a major difference from how I had lived before. In Christianity, we prayed before meals. We thanked God for food. But this felt more embodied, more reciprocal, more ritualized. The food passed through offering.
Then came back changed.
Or perhaps I came back changed, because I was learning gratitude not as a sentence, but as an action.
Was there a point where you realized these practices were changing your identity?
Yes, it happened gradually, but one moment stands out. I had been chanting quietly for several weeks, lighting a lamp, reading the Bhagavad Gita, visiting the temple when I could, offering food occasionally, and one evening, I realized something. My day had begun to organize itself around Hindu rhythms. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but noticeably. I was thinking about karma before speaking harshly. I was thinking about Dharma when making decisions. I was thinking about attachment when I felt anxious. I was thinking about the self when I felt overwhelmed by ego. I was remembering mantra when my mind spiraled. That is when I realized Hinduism was no longer outside me. It was interpreting my life from within. That realization frightened me again. But it also brought clarity, because identity is not changed by one declaration. Identity changes through repeated orientation, what you return to, what you bow before, what language you use when you suffer, what practices shape your day, what concepts explain your life. By then, Hinduism had started doing all of that.
Did you still think of yourself as Christian then?
That became harder and harder. For a while, I tried to hold both. I told myself I was spiritually open. I told myself I was learning. I told myself I still respected Jesus. And all of that was true. But at some point, I had to be honest. My deepest framework had changed. I no longer believed that salvation depended on accepting one exclusive historical claim. I no longer believed humanity was divided into saved and lost. I no longer believed images were automatically idolatrous. I no longer believed non-Christian worship was spiritually empty. I no longer believed the soul had only one life followed by eternal judgment. And I was no longer merely admiring Hinduism, I was practicing it. That was the point where avoidance became impossible. I had crossed from study into devotion, and devotion reveals where the heart has already gone.
What did that realization feel like?
Terrifying and peaceful, both at once. Terrifying because I knew what it meant. I knew that if I followed this honestly, I would have to admit that I was no longer Christian in the way I had been. That would affect my family, my community, my identity, my memories, my future. But peaceful because I also knew something else. I had not become less reverent. I had not become less moral. I had not become less devoted to truth. I had become more aware, more disciplined, more compassionate, more spiritually alive. And that mattered, because the deepest fear I carried was that leaving Christianity meant leaving God. But the more I practiced Hinduism, the more I felt the opposite. I was not leaving God. I was finding the divine in a wider, older, more expansive way than I had ever imagined. That was the moment the journey stopped being theoretical. That was the moment Hinduism became real. Not just in a book, not just in a temple, not just in Sanskrit. In me.
Sarah, throughout this journey, we've talked about Sanskrit, temples, karma, rebirth, moksha, mantra, and daily practice. But there is one part of Hinduism we haven't really discussed yet. And for many Western women who encounter Hindu traditions, it becomes one of the most emotionally powerful discoveries. The divine feminine, Lakshmi, Saraswati, Durga, Parvati, the goddess. Did that affect you?
Oh my God! Malini? More than I expected. Much more. And what's interesting is that I didn't realize how much it was affecting me at first. Because when people hear goddess worship, they often immediately jump into arguments, theology, comparative religion, polytheism, monotheism. But my experience wasn't intellectual at first. It was emotional. Very emotional. I remember standing in a temple one day and watching women pray before Lakshmi Mata. Mothers, grandmothers, young women, little girls. And I suddenly realized I was witnessing something I had never seen in my entire life. Women approaching the divine through a feminine form. That had never been part of my spiritual experience growing up. Never.
But Christianity does have women. Mary, for example, female saints, women in the Bible. Why was this different?
Because the difference wasn't the presence of women. The difference was the presence of divinity expressed through feminine symbolism. Growing up Christian, the language surrounding God was overwhelmingly masculine. God the Father, Lord, King, Heavenly Father. The Son. The imagery itself wasn't necessarily problematic for me at the time because it was all I had ever known. But once I encountered Hindu traditions, I suddenly realized there was an entire spiritual dimension I had never considered. In Hinduism, wisdom can be feminine. Compassion can be feminine. I was attending a temple event where the Sri Suktam were being recited. By this point, I knew enough Sanskrit to recognize some words. Not everything, but enough. And I remember listening to these verses dedicated to Lakshmi Mata. The atmosphere was beautiful. Flowers, lamps, families, the rhythm of the chanting, the ancient Sanskrit. And I found myself thinking about continuity again. These weren't newly written prayers. These weren't modern inventions. These were sacred verses that had survived through centuries of transmission. People had recited them before kings, before empires rose and fell, before entire nations existed. And now I was hearing them in Texas. That realization alone was extraordinary. But what moved me even more was the subject itself. The idea that prosperity wasn't simply money. The idea that abundance included harmony, beauty, nourishment, generosity, and well-being. I realized Lakshmi Mata represented something much richer than what I initially assumed. And suddenly, the symbolism felt profoundly human.
I noticed that you often use Mata when you talk about female divinity.
What can I say? I have gone from Heavenly Father to Heavenly Mother.
Wow, that's profound. Did Sanskrit play a role here too?
Absolutely. In fact, Sanskrit made the experience even more powerful. Because the more Sanskrit I learned, the more I realized that many Hindu ideas lose depth when reduced to simple English translations. Take Lakshmi Mata. People often say, goddess of wealth, but that barely scratches the surface. Or Saraswati Mata. People say, goddess of knowledge. Again, that's only part of it. These traditions had layers. Philosophical layers, psychological layers, spiritual layers, civilizational layers. And Sanskrit preserved those layers. The language itself became a bridge into a way of seeing reality that I had never encountered before.
What about Durga? Because for many Westerners, Durga can be shocking.
Durga Mata completely challenged my assumptions. Completely. Growing up Christian, I associated feminine holiness primarily with gentleness, compassion, mercy, forgiveness. And those qualities are beautiful. But then I encountered Mata Durga. And suddenly I was looking at another dimension of the sacred. Strength, protection, courage, the destruction of evil, the defense of righteousness. And all of it expressed through a feminine form. That was astonishing to me. I remember seeing images of Mata Durga standing victorious over Mahishasur, weapons in her hands, fearlessness in her expression. And I thought, I've never seen anything like this before. Not because Christianity lacks strong women, it certainly has them, but because I had never seen cosmic power itself represented through feminine imagery. That was a profound difference.
Did this change how you viewed women or how you viewed yourself?
It changed both. Not politically, spiritually. That's an important distinction. I wasn't looking for a political statement. I wasn't looking for social commentary. What affected me was something deeper. I realized that Hindu traditions offered symbolic pathways through which women could directly identify with aspects of the divine. A young girl could look at Saraswati Mata and see learning. A mother could look at Mata Lakshmi and see nurturing abundance. Someone facing adversity could look at Mata Durga and see strength. Someone seeking devotion could look at Parvati Mata and see love. The symbolism was incredibly rich, And for the first time, I felt like I was seeing dimensions of spiritual life that had previously been invisible to me.
Did this create tension with your Christian upbringing?
Yes, very much. Because I had been taught that anything resembling goddess worship was automatically false. That was the assumption. Not a nuanced critique, a categorical rejection. But now I was encountering something much more sophisticated. People weren't worshipping women. They were encountering aspects of divine reality through feminine forms and symbols. And the more I studied, the more I discovered something even more interesting. Many Hindus would explain that ultimate reality transcends gender entirely. The divine is not literally male, nor literally female. Both become windows. Both become approaches. Both become sacred expressions. That idea fascinated me, because suddenly the question wasn't, is God male or female? The question became, why should the infinite be limited by either category? That was a profound shift.
Was there a particular festival that affected you?
Navratri. Without question, Navratri was extraordinary. Because it wasn't merely a theological idea, it was lived. Families gathering, children participating, women leading ceremonies, devotional singing, stories, offerings, community. And at the center of it all was reverence for the Divine Mother. I remember watching young girls being honored during one event, and someone explained the symbolism. The divine present even within the child, the sacred reflected in human life itself. And I remember feeling deeply moved, because I was witnessing a civilization expressing reverence in a way I had never experienced before.
How did this connect to your growing practice?
More than I realized at the time. Because by then, Hinduism was no longer just philosophy for me. It was becoming devotion, and devotion changes things. When I began lighting a lamp each evening, I sometimes found myself reciting verses dedicated to Lakshmi or Saraswati Mata. At first it felt unfamiliar, then gradually it felt natural. The prayers weren't asking me to fear. They weren't asking me to divide humanity into saved and unsaved. They weren't asking me to condemn anyone. They were asking me to cultivate qualities, wisdom, compassion, discipline, generosity, humility, and that resonated deeply.
Looking back now, what was the deeper lesson? What did the Divine Mother ultimately teach you?
That the sacred is larger than my imagination. That is the simplest answer. Growing up Christian, I inherited a particular picture of God, and for many years I assumed that picture was complete. Then Hinduism showed me dimensions I had never considered. Not because my earlier experiences were worthless, but because they were partial. The Divine Mother taught me that reality is richer than a single image, richer than a single metaphor, richer than a single cultural expression. And perhaps most importantly, she taught me that strength and compassion are not opposites. Wisdom and love are not opposites. Power and nurturing are not opposites. All of these can coexist within the sacred. That realization changed me deeply.
Sarah, before we move on, there is one thing we haven't talked about. Over the years, I've heard many converts describe a particular text, prayer, or chant that affected them so deeply that it almost became a companion. Was there anything like that for you?
Yes, without question. The Lalita Sahasranam. And honestly, I wasn't expecting it. Not at all. Because by this point, I had already fallen in love with Sanskrit. I loved its precision, its beauty, its depth. I loved listening to the Rudram. I loved the Sri Sukta. I loved hearing priests recite texts that had been preserved for centuries. But the Lalita Sahasranam was different. It didn't feel like something I merely studied. It felt like something that slowly entered my heart.
For people who may not know, what is the Lalita Sahasranama?
Literally, it means the 1,000 names of Lalita. Lalita Tripuru Sundari, the Divine Mother. And at first, I approached it academically, the same way I approached everything else. I wanted to understand the Sanskrit, the structure, the theology, the history. But the more I listened to it, the less academic it became. Because something extraordinary happens when you hear it recited. The names keep unfolding, one after another, each name revealing a different aspect of the divine. Compassion, wisdom, beauty, power, grace, consciousness, creation, protection, transcendence, immanence. It felt less like a text and more like 1,000 windows opening onto the same infinite reality. and I had never encountered anything like that before.
What affected you so much about it?
The combination of beauty and depth. Growing up Christian, I loved hymns. I loved worship music. I loved the emotional experience of devotion. But this felt different. The Lalita Sahasranam wasn't simply expressing devotion. It was teaching philosophy through devotion. Every name carried meaning. Every name carried symbolism. Every name pointed towards some aspect of reality, some aspect of consciousness, some aspect of the divine. And because I was studying Sanskrit, I began looking up individual names. One name would lead to another, then another, then another. And before I knew it, I wasn't simply listening. I was contemplating, reflecting, meditating. The text became a universe.
Was there a particular moment when it became personal?
Yes, I remember listening to a recording late one evening. The house was quiet, the lights were low, a small lamp was burning, and the recitation was playing softly. The rhythm was gentle, almost hypnotic. And suddenly, I realized something. For years, I had been searching for remnants of ancient spirituality. Fragments, echoes, lost traditions. Yet here I was, listening to something that had survived. Something that had been recited generation after generation. Something that mothers had taught daughters. Something that families had preserved. Something that temples had protected. Something that still lived. And then, oh God,
Sarah? Are you okay? Dear? Take your time. We can resume when you're feeling better. Welcome back, Sarah. What happened? You were discussing a particular evening, listening to the Lalita Sahasranam, and you suddenly started sobbing.
I am so sorry, Malini. I am fine now. This frequently happens to me when I relive that evening. I sobbed that day too, uncontrollably, for over 15 minutes. Not because of one particular verse, not because of one particular doctrine, but because I felt I was touching something ancient and alive at the same time. That affected me so profoundly, it broke me emotionally. In a wonderful way. And reliving that moment puts my back there immediately.
No need to apologize. You had a wonderful, touching experience with Mata. Did it change how you thought about the Divine Mother?
Completely! Because until then, the Divine Mother had been an idea, a concept, a theological category. The Lalita Sahasranam made her feel real. Not real in the sense of proving something intellectually, but real in the sense that devotion became personal. The divine was no longer merely a philosophical principle. The divine became intimate, beautiful, accessible, loving, mysterious. And I remember thinking about my Christian upbringing. I thought about all the years I had prayed to a Heavenly Father. And suddenly, I found myself asking a question I had never considered before. If ultimate reality transcends gender, why had I never been invited to approach the divine as mother? That question stayed with me for a very long time.
Looking back now, what role did the Lalita Sahasranama play in your journey?
I think it softened my heart. The Gita challenged my mind. Karma challenged my assumptions. Rebirth challenged my theology. The temple challenged my stereotypes. But the Lalita Sahasranam touched something deeper. It taught me that devotion could be beautiful without being exclusive, profound without being threatening, ancient without being obsolete. And perhaps most importantly, it showed me that Hinduism was not merely a system of ideas. It was a civilization of love, a civilization of memory, a civilization that had spent centuries exploring every possible relationship between the human soul and the divine. And once I experienced that, something changed. Because I realized that I was no longer simply evaluating Hinduism. I was falling in love with it.
At this point in the story, you've encountered temples, Sanskrit, mantra, karma, rebirth, moksha, and now the Divine Mother. You've begun practicing. You've begun seeing the world differently. So let me ask the question that seems unavoidable. What was happening to Jesus during all of this? Because sooner or later, you had to confront not merely Hinduism, you had to confront Christianity itself. And perhaps more importantly, you had to confront the doctrines you had built your entire life around.
Yes, and that was the hardest part of all. Because the issue was never whether I admired Jesus. The issue was whether I could still honestly believe everything Christianity required me to believe about him. And eventually, I couldn't avoid that question anymore.
How do you move from Christianity to Hinduism without confronting the central claims of Christianity itself? So let's begin there. When did you realize that your growing attraction to Hinduism was creating a problem for your Christian beliefs?
Honestly, much later than people think. I think many people imagine that I started doubting Jesus first and then became interested in Hinduism. But my journey was almost the opposite. For a long time, I was trying desperately to keep Jesus, trying desperately to keep Christianity, trying desperately to make everything fit together. Even after visiting temples, even after studying Sanskrit, even after reading the Bhagavad Gita, even after beginning my own practice, I was still trying to preserve some version of my Christian identity, because Christianity wasn't just a set of ideas. It was my childhood, my family, my memories, my prayers, my deepest understanding of God. Letting go of that wasn't easy. It was heartbreaking. And so for years, I kept looking for ways to hold both worlds together.
What did that look like?
At first, I told myself I was simply broadening my understanding. I would say things like, maybe Hinduism contains truths that Christianity overlooked. Or maybe Jesus was teaching something deeper than modern Christians realize. Or maybe all religions are describing the same reality in different ways. Those ideas allowed me to postpone the real question. And I think part of me wanted to postpone it. Because once you ask the real question, you can't go back. The real question wasn't, can I appreciate Hinduism? The real question was, can I still affirm the doctrines that make Christianity Christianity? And those are very different questions.
What doctrines are we talking about specifically?
Several, but they all revolved around one central claim: exclusivity. The idea that God revealed himself uniquely and finally through Jesus. The idea that salvation depends upon accepting Jesus. The idea that humanity is ultimately divided according to its relationship with Jesus. Everything else flows from that. And that idea became increasingly difficult for me. Not because I disliked Jesus, but because I could no longer reconcile it with reality.
Explain that.
By this point in my life, I had spent years meeting sincere spiritual people. Not abstract categories, not stereotypes, real people. I had met Hindus whose lives radiated compassion. I had met people whose commitment to Dharma humbled me. I had met families whose devotion was genuine. I had watched priests spend decades mastering sacred recitation. I had listened to portions of the Dharmakam and Chamakam being preserved with astonishing precision. I had watched mothers teaching the Lalita Sahasranamam to their daughters. I had seen people structure their lives around service, devotion, discipline, gratitude, and self-control. And eventually I found myself asking, what exactly am I supposed to do with all of this? Because according to the framework I inherited, none of it mattered if Jesus had not been accepted. That conclusion became harder and harder for me to accept.
Was it just an emotional objection? Or was it intellectual too?
Both. Very much both. Emotionally, I struggled with the idea that billions of people could be excluded because of historical circumstance. But intellectually, I began questioning something else. The assumption that God had revealed himself only once, only in one culture, only in one historical setting, only through one person. The more I studied Hindu traditions, the more strange that assumption began to feel. Because Hindu civilization was not spiritually empty. It was overflowing with spiritual inquiry. Thousands of years of inquiry. Questions about consciousness, questions about ethics, questions about suffering, questions about the nature of reality, questions about liberation, questions about the soul, questions about the divine. And I found myself wondering, would a loving God simply ignore all of that? Would God reveal truth to one tiny portion of humanity and leave everyone else fundamentally mistaken? That no longer felt plausible to me.
Was the concept of avatar important here?
Extremely important, because it challenged one of Christianity's most fundamental assumptions. Growing up Christian, I believed God became incarnate once. One unique incarnation. One unique savior.
one unique event. Then I encountered the Hindu idea of avatar. Not merely one manifestation, multiple manifestations. Different forms, different eras, different circumstances, different needs. Now, I'm not saying every Hindu understands it the same way. Hindu traditions are incredibly diverse. But the underlying idea fascinated me. The divine meeting humanity repeatedly. The divine expressing itself in ways suited to different ages and different peoples. That seemed far more expansive than the framework I had inherited. And once I began thinking that way, the uniqueness claims surrounding Jesus started looking very different.
Did you begin seeing Jesus differently?
Yes, slowly. And that was painful. Because I loved Jesus. I genuinely did. I still do, in a different way. People often assume that leaving Christianity means becoming hostile to Jesus. That wasn't my experience at all. The opposite happened. For a long time, I was trying to save Jesus from the theological framework around him, trying to separate the man from the doctrines, trying to understand what he actually taught versus what Christianity eventually became. And that process led me into some very difficult territory.
Let's talk about that difficult territory. Because I think many Christians listening to this interview are going to say, wait a minute, it's one thing to admire Hinduism. It's one thing to learn Sanskrit. It's one thing to appreciate the Bhagavad Gita. But Christianity ultimately stands or falls on the person of Jesus. So let me ask you directly, did you eventually conclude that Christianity had misunderstood Jesus? Or did you conclude that Jesus himself was not who Christianity claimed he was?
Both. And arriving at that conclusion was incredibly painful. Because growing up Christian, I didn't merely admire Jesus, I worshipped him. I prayed to him. I believed he was literally the Son of God. I believed he was born of a virgin. I believed he died for humanity's sins. I believed he physically rose from the dead. I believed he was the only path to salvation. Those weren't peripheral beliefs. Those were the center of my worldview. So when those beliefs began to unravel, it wasn't a minor adjustment. It felt like an earthquake that shook the foundations of everything I thought I knew.
What unraveled first?
The exclusivity. Without question. The exclusivity unraveled first, because by then, I had spent years immersed in Hindu traditions. I had seen wisdom. I had seen devotion. I had seen discipline. I had seen spiritual depth. And eventually, I found myself asking a question I could not answer. If a person sincerely follows Dharma, if a person sincerely pursues truth, if a person cultivates compassion, if a person dedicates themselves to the divine, why would their eternal destiny depend upon accepting one specific historical claim? That question haunted me, because Christianity's answer ultimately remained the same. Jesus. Jesus was the dividing line. Jesus was the gate. Jesus was the only way. And the more I reflected on that, the more arbitrary it began to feel. Not loving, not universal, arbitrary. Because access to that belief depends so heavily on where and when someone is born, and I could no longer reconcile that with a truly universal divine reality.
Was that when you stopped believing Jesus was the only way?
Yes, that was the first major break. And once that happened, the rest began unraveling. Because the doctrines are connected. You cannot easily remove exclusivity while keeping everything else intact. Once I no longer believed Jesus was the only path to the divine, I had to ask why Christianity insisted he was. And that led me into deeper questions. Questions about history, questions about theology, questions about how doctrines develop, questions about how religions interpret extraordinary people. And gradually, I found myself seeing Jesus differently, not as less important, but differently.
Differently how?
I stopped seeing him as unique, and I began seeing him as extraordinary. Those are not the same thing. As a Christian, I believed Jesus stood completely alone, unlike every prophet, unlike every saint, unlike every sage, unlike every spiritual teacher. Entirely unique, entirely separate, entirely singular. But Hindu traditions had introduced me to a different possibility. The possibility that extraordinary spiritual beings appear throughout human history. The possibility that wisdom is not confined to one culture. The possibility that divine insight can manifest repeatedly. And once I accepted that possibility, Jesus no longer needed to occupy a category by himself. He could be revered without being exclusive.
He could be honored without invalidating everyone else. That distinction became very important to me.
But eventually we have to ask the hard question. Do you still believe Jesus was literally the Son of God?
No, I don't. And saying those words took years. Years! Because I resisted that conclusion with everything I had. I wanted to preserve it. I really did. But eventually, I realized that my belief was no longer honest. I no longer believed God had one biological son. I no longer believed humanity's relationship to the divine depended upon that claim. I no longer believed Jesus occupied an ontologically unique category separating him from every other spiritual figure in history. Instead, I came to see him as a profoundly realized spiritual teacher, an extraordinary human being, possibly one of the greatest spiritual teachers humanity has ever produced, but human. Still human. And once I reached that conclusion, I could no longer honestly affirm traditional Christian doctrine.
What about the virgin birth?
I no longer believe it literally happened. And I don't say that disrespectfully. I understand how important that doctrine is for Christians. It was important to me too. But once I stepped outside the Christian framework, I began seeing miraculous birth narratives differently. Not only in Christianity, in many traditions. Throughout history, great spiritual figures often become surrounded by sacred stories. Stories that communicate significance. Stories that communicate holiness. Stories that communicate reverence. Today, I view the virgin birth primarily as part of Christianity's sacred narrative, rather than a historical event that determines the fate of humanity. And that shift changed everything.
What about the resurrection? Because for many Christians, that's the heart of Christianity.
I know. And that's why this was so difficult. The resurrection isn't a minor doctrine. It is the doctrine. Growing up, I believed Jesus physically rose from the dead. I believed that event proved his unique status. I believed it validated Christianity's exclusive claims. But eventually, I stopped viewing the resurrection as a historical requirement for spiritual truth. Because I encountered wisdom that was true regardless of miracle claims. I encountered Dharma that was meaningful regardless of miracle claims. I encountered profound spiritual insight that did not depend upon suspending historical skepticism. And gradually, I realized something. My respect for Jesus no longer depended upon whether every miracle story occurred exactly as described. What mattered was the life he lived, the compassion he embodied, the wisdom he taught, the transformation he inspired. Those things remained meaningful, but the miracle claims no longer carried the theological weight they once had.
Did Hinduism contribute to that shift?
Very much, because Hinduism constantly redirected my attention toward transformation. Not belief alone, transformation. The question wasn't, what miracle do you affirm? The question was, what are you becoming? Are you becoming more truthful, more compassionate, more disciplined, more self-controlled, more aware, more devoted, more aligned with Dharma? That emphasis affected me profoundly because it shifted spirituality from historical claims to lived reality. And once that shift happened, many Christian doctrines started feeling less central than they once had.
Let's talk about hell, because earlier in the interview, you mentioned struggling with eternal punishment. Where did you finally land?
I stopped believing in eternal hell, completely. And that was another major break, because once I accepted karma and punarjanma, the entire framework changed. I no longer saw the universe as a place where finite actions receive infinite punishment. I no longer saw life as a single examination followed by irreversible consequences. Instead, I saw existence as a process of growth, a process of learning, a process of consequence, a process of awakening. That didn't eliminate responsibility. In many ways, it intensified responsibility. But it removed the disproportion. It removed the idea that one lifetime determines eternity. And that brought me enormous relief.
Relief?
Yes, relief. Because for years, I had carried questions that Christianity never fully resolved for me. Questions about billions of people born outside Christianity. Questions about unequal circumstances. Questions about justice. Questions about mercy. Questions about proportionality. Hinduism didn't answer every question. No tradition does. But it gave me a framework that felt more coherent, more compassionate, more expansive, more aligned with the reality I observed. And once I saw that framework, I couldn't unsee it.
So if Jesus walked into this room right now, how would you see him?
With enormous respect, with genuine reverence, but not with exclusivity. I would see him as a great spiritual teacher, a saint, a profoundly realized human being, someone whose life continues to inspire millions, someone whose teachings still contain wisdom, someone worthy of study, someone worthy of admiration. But I would not see him as the only path to the divine. I would not see him as humanity's sole mediator. And I would not see acceptance of him as the dividing line between salvation and damnation. That is probably the clearest way I can explain it. My respect remained. My theology changed.
Was there a moment when you realized there was no going back? A moment when you knew you would never honestly call yourself Christian again?
Yes, there was. And surprisingly, it didn't happen in a temple. It didn't happen during a chant. It didn't happen while reading the Bhagavad Gita. It happened during prayer. I was sitting quietly one evening, a lamp burning nearby, a copy of the Bhagavad Gita open beside me, and I remember realizing that if someone walked into the room and asked me a simple question, "Do you believe Jesus is the only way to God?" I could no longer answer yes. Not honestly. And once that happened, everything else followed. Because Christianity is not merely admiration for Jesus. Christianity rests upon specific claims about Jesus, claims I no longer believed. The moment I admitted that to myself, I knew something fundamental had changed.
What did that realization feel like?
Grief and freedom at the same time. Grief because an entire chapter of my life was ending, a chapter filled with memories, family, church, prayer, songs, traditions, people I loved. But freedom because I was finally being honest. I was no longer forcing myself to believe something I no longer believed. I was no longer trying to fit my experiences into a framework that no longer made sense to me. For the first time, I felt aligned. My mind, my heart, my practice, my worldview, all moving in the same direction. And once that happened, a new question emerged. Not, am I still Christian? That question had already been answered. The new question was, if I am no longer Christian, then who am I becoming? And strangely enough, the answer to that question began with a name I kept encountering over and over again, a name I couldn't stop thinking about, a name that, at the time, I didn't realize would eventually become my own.
What did you mean by that?
For a long time, I didn't think much about names, at least not spiritually. Growing up Christian, my name was simply my name. It was part of my identity, part of my family, part of my history. But it wasn't something I spent a great deal of time reflecting upon. That changed as I became immersed in Hindu traditions. Because one of the things that fascinated me was how much meaning seemed to be attached to names. Not just personal names, the names of deities, the names found in scriptures, the names embedded within a mantra, the names recited in hymns, the names preserved through centuries of devotion. And nowhere did I encounter that more profoundly than in the Lalita Sahasranamam.
We're returning to the Lalita Sahasranamam again. It seems to have become very important to you.
It has become like life-giving oxygen for me. Even reciting a few words, it fills me with spiritual ecstasy. The more I listened to it, the more I studied it, the more I found myself drawn into it. At first, I was simply fascinated by the Sanskrit. Then I became fascinated by the meanings, then by the symbolism, then by the theology, and eventually by the devotion itself. I remember spending evenings reading commentaries, looking up individual names, tracing references, trying to understand why certain names had inspired devotion for centuries. And what struck me was that the names weren't merely labels. They were descriptions, windows, perspectives, each one revealing a different aspect of reality, a different aspect of the divine. And the more I immersed myself in that world, the more I began reflecting on identity itself.
Identity in what sense?
Who we are, who we think we are, who we become.
Those questions became very important to me, because by this point, almost everything in my life had changed. My theology had changed, my spiritual practices had changed, my understanding of the soul had changed, my understanding of God had changed, even my daily routines had changed. I was chanting, reading the Bhagavad Gita, visiting temples, participating in festivals, observing practices that would have been unimaginable to my younger self. Yet outwardly, I was still Sarah. And that created a strange tension, because internally I felt like a different person, but externally I was still carrying an identity that belonged to a life I was slowly leaving behind.
Was that uncomfortable?
Not uncomfortable exactly, more confusing.
I felt caught between worlds. Not Christian anymore, not fully Hindu yet, not who I used to be, not entirely sure who I was becoming. And I think many converts experience that. There is a period where the old identity has loosened, but the new one has not yet fully formed. You find yourself living in an in-between space. And that is where I was.
So where does the name enter the story?
Very gradually. Not dramatically, not through a revelation, not through a ceremony. Actually, it started with curiosity. I began noticing certain names appearing repeatedly in texts and devotional literature. Certain names seemed to carry extraordinary emotional weight for people, and I became fascinated by why. What made a name meaningful? Why did people feel connected to particular names? Why did some names seem to express entire spiritual ideals? I wasn't looking for a new name, not at all. That wasn't even on my radar. I was simply observing, learning, listening. But there was one name that kept appearing. Again, and again, and again.
What was the name?
I'm not ready to reveal it yet.
Because honestly, at that stage, I wasn't even admitting it to myself. I would encounter it in texts, in chants, in conversations, in devotional literature. And each time, I would pause. Something about it resonated with me. Not because it sounded exotic, not because it sounded beautiful, though it was beautiful, but because of what it represented, the values attached to it, the qualities attached to it, the spiritual ideal attached to it. And every time I encountered it, I found myself lingering on it, thinking about it, reflecting on it.
Did anyone suggest that you take a Hindu name?
No, that's actually important. Nobody pressured me. Nobody told me I needed a Hindu name. Nobody suggested I abandon my old identity. In fact, most of the Hindus I knew seemed completely comfortable with whatever name I used. The pressure wasn't coming from outside. The questions were coming from inside. And those questions became stronger over time, because I started realizing that names in Hindu traditions often reflect aspiration, not merely identity. Aspiration. The person you hope to become, the qualities you wish to cultivate, the relationship you wish to develop with the divine. That was a completely different way of thinking about names than I was accustomed to, and it fascinated me.
Was there a specific event that intensified those feelings?
Yes, a temple festival. One evening, I was helping with preparations for a celebration, arranging flowers, helping organize items. Nothing particularly important, just volunteering. And I remember looking around the room. There were families, children, grandparents, young professionals, students, people from different backgrounds, different professions, different ages. Yet everyone seemed connected through something deeper than culture, something deeper than ethnicity, something deeper than language. There was a shared spiritual vocabulary, a shared relationship to tradition, a shared relationship to the sacred. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question that genuinely startled me. Not, do I admire Hinduism? Not, do I agree with Hindu philosophy? But, do I belong here? That question frightened me, because it implied something much larger than intellectual agreement. It implied home. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that realization.
Did you answer the question?
Not immediately. I resisted it. Honestly, because belonging is a very serious thing, especially when it means leaving another community behind. But the question stayed with me, and as it stayed with me, something else happened. I began meeting people who weren't merely talking about Hinduism, they were living it. Quietly, naturally, without trying to convince anyone. And one of those people would eventually change my life in ways I never expected.
You're talking about someone specific.
Yes, I am. And the funny thing is that I wasn't looking for him, not even remotely. At that point, romance was the last thing on my mind. I was wrestling with theology, identity, family, spiritual transformation. The idea of meeting someone felt almost irrelevant. And yet, looking back now, I can see that the next chapter of my life was already beginning. Not through philosophy, not through scripture, not through debate, but through a person.
Lalita Mata
Brought him into my life. I am totally convinced about this. A person who embodied many of the values I had spent years studying. A person whose life showed me what lived Dharma actually looked like. And without realizing it, I was about to discover that ideas are one thing. Watching those ideas become a human life is something else entirely.
Sarah, you said Lalita Devi brought a man into your life. You said the next chapter of your life didn't begin through a book. It didn't begin through philosophy. It didn't begin through a temple. It began through a person. And you also said something else. You weren't looking for him. So let's start there. Who was he?
His name was Raghav. And if I'm being completely honest, I barely noticed him at first. Not because there was anything wrong with him. Quite the opposite. It's because he wasn't trying to be noticed. And that's actually one of the first things that stood out to me. Looking back, I think I had spent years around people who were trying to impress others, trying to be important, trying to be seen, trying to be heard. Raghav wasn't like that. At all. He moved through the world quietly, competently, respectfully, almost effortlessly. And because of that, he was easy to overlook. At least initially.
Where did you meet him?
At the Meenakshi temple.
Looking back at it now, it is as if Mata herself arranged the match. Though not in the dramatic way people imagine. There wasn't some movie moment. No mystical music, no instant romance, no lightning bolt from heaven. We met because we kept volunteering for the same events. Temple festivals, community meals, fundraisers, holiday celebrations. Simple things, the kinds of things that happen behind the scenes. And over time, I started noticing him. Not because he was trying to stand out, but because he consistently wasn't.
What do you mean?
I mean, he was always helping, but never positioning himself to receive credit. Always serving, never performing. And that struck me, because by this point, I had spent years studying Dharma, reading about it, discussing it, reflecting on it, trying to understand it. But Raghav wasn't talking about Dharma. He was living it. And there is a difference, a very big difference. One teaches, the other demonstrates.
Can you give an example?
Several, actually. One of the first things I noticed was how he treated older people. Not performatively, not because anyone was watching, just naturally. I remember seeing him greet an elderly couple one evening. Immediately, he bent down and touched their feet, then stood up and spoke with them respectfully. The entire interaction lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it stayed with me. Because growing up in America, I had never seen anything like that. Respect existed, of course, but not expressed that way, not embodied that way. And what struck me wasn't the gesture itself, it was the sincerity. There was no awkwardness, no self-consciousness, no sense of obligation. It was simply how he related to elders, as a natural expression of respect. And I remember thinking, this man actually believes the values he talks about.
Did you ask him about it?
Eventually.
And his answer was very simple. He said, "If I can't honor the people who give life, how can I claim to honor the divine?" That answer stayed with me because it reflected something I kept encountering in Hindu traditions. The sacred wasn't confined to the temple. It wasn't confined to prayer. It wasn't confined to scripture. It extended into ordinary relationships. Parents, teachers, family, community, everyday life. And Raghav seemed to live that naturally.
What else stood out?
His relationship with spirituality. Or maybe I should say his lack of performance. That sounds strange, but it's true. By this point, I had met many religious people. Some Christian, some Hindu, some from other traditions. And often religion becomes part of someone's identity performance. Something they project, something they advertise, something they use to signal virtue. Raghav wasn't like that. He almost never talked about his spirituality unless someone asked. But it was visible everywhere. Visible in his habits, visible in his decisions, visible in the way he treated people, visible in the way he carried himself. And that impressed me far more than speeches ever could.
Can you give another example?
Yes, a simple one. Food. One evening after a temple event, a group of us went out to eat. Nothing formal, just friends. The food arrived. Everyone started digging in. But before touching his meal, Raghav paused. Just for a moment. Closed his eyes, took some water in his palm, and did what I now know as Parisechanam. I had not seen many Hindus in America observe this ritual before eating, although I had learned about it during my exploration phase of Hinduism. Then he started eating. No announcement, no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, just gratitude. a habit, a rhythm, a relationship with the sacred woven into ordinary life. And I remember thinking, this is what I have been searching for. Not religion as an occasional activity, religion as a way of being.
That's a strong statement. This is what I've been searching for.
Because it was. For years, I had been exploring ideas, questions, philosophy, texts, theology. But Raghav showed me something different. He showed me what happens when those ideas become a life. And that was powerful. Very powerful. Because I realized something uncomfortable. It is easy to admire wisdom. It is much harder to embody it. Anyone can quote the Bhagavad Gita. Anyone can discuss Dharma. Anyone can debate philosophy. But can you live it? Can you remain calm when you're frustrated? Can you remain respectful when nobody is watching? Can you remain generous when there is no reward? Can you remain disciplined when life becomes difficult? Those questions mattered, and Raghav seemed to answer them, not with words, but with actions.
Was there a particular moment when you started seeing him differently? Not as a friend, not as a fellow volunteer, but as someone special?
Yes, though it wasn't romantic at first, it was admiration.
I remember one temple festival where everything was going wrong. Schedules were behind, volunteers were stressed, people were frustrated, everyone was tired. And somehow, Raghav remained calm. Not passive, not indifferent, calm. He solved problems, helped people, encouraged volunteers, moved from task to task, and never raised his voice, never blamed anyone, never complained. And I remember watching him from across the room thinking, where does that come from? Because that kind of steadiness isn't an accident. That kind of steadiness is cultivated. And for the first time, I saw something I had previously encountered only in books.
Did he know what was happening inside you?
Not at all. Not even remotely. At least, not then. Because honestly, I was fighting it. I wasn't looking for a relationship. I was still trying to understand my own identity. I was still wrestling with Christianity, still wrestling with family, still wrestling with who I was becoming. The last thing I wanted was additional emotional complexity. But Mata had other plans for me. And the more time I spent around him, the harder it became to ignore what I was seeing.
What exactly were you seeing?
Integrity. That's the word. Integrity, not perfection. Nobody is perfect. Certainly not me. Certainly not Raghav. But integrity. The alignment between belief and action, between values and behavior, between spirituality and daily life. And I realized something. The reason I admired him wasn't because he was Hindu. It was because he was becoming the kind of person I wanted to become. More disciplined, more centered, more compassionate, more grounded, more devoted, more aligned. And that realization was both beautiful and terrifying. Because once admiration reaches that level, something else often follows. And deep down, I think I already knew it, even if I wasn't ready to admit it.
Was that the beginning of love?
Not yet, but it was the beginning of something. The beginning of trust, the beginning of respect, the beginning of seeing another human being not merely as attractive, but as aspirational. And that's a very different foundation, because attraction can happen quickly. Respect takes time. Trust takes time. Admiration takes time. And what I was feeling for Raghav was being built slowly, quietly, one observation at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of character at a time. I wasn't falling in love with a fantasy. I was falling in love with a life, a way of being, a vision of what a human being could become when spirituality moved beyond belief and entered everyday existence. And without realizing it, that realization was about to change everything. Because eventually, I would have to ask myself a difficult question. Not who Raghav was, but who I was becoming in his presence. And strangely enough, that question would lead me back to the same name that had been quietly following me for years. A name I still wasn't ready to admit had become part of my own story.
Sarah, you said something that really stood out to me. You said, I wasn't falling in love with a fantasy. I was falling in love with a life. That's a very unusual thing to say. Most people talk about attraction, chemistry, romance. You seem to be talking about something deeper. What did you mean?
I think what I meant is that by this point in my journey, I had become very suspicious of ideals that existed only in books. Not because books aren't important. They are. The Bhagavad Gita changed my life. The Upanishad changed my life. The Lalita Sahasranamam changed my life. But eventually, every philosophy has to answer a simple question. What kind of human being does it produce? That's where the theory meets reality. And Raghav became the first person in my life who made me ask that question seriously. Not because he was perfect, he wasn't, but because the gap between what he believed and how he lived was unusually small. And that impressed me, more than I can adequately explain.
What were some of the things you observed?
Hundreds of little things, tiny things, the kind of things most people overlook. I remember one morning during a temple event, a group of us had arrived early. Volunteers were setting things up. The priests were preparing for the day's activities, and I noticed Raghav standing quietly in a corner. Not talking, not scrolling through his phone, not waiting for instructions. Just softly reciting something, almost under his breath. Later, I asked him what he was saying, and he smiled and said, "A few verses from the Ishavasya Upanishad." That answer stayed with me, because it wasn't performative. He wasn't trying to appear spiritual. He genuinely wanted to begin his day with something sacred. And I realized that spirituality for him wasn't an activity. It was an orientation, a way of inhabiting the world.
Did you find that attractive?
Very much so. I also found it fascinating, because growing up Christian, religion had often felt compartmentalized. Sunday, Bible study, prayer group, specific times, specific places, specific activities. But with Raghav, spirituality seemed woven into everything. Meals, work, family, friendships, temple, study, even ordinary conversations. And I remember thinking, how does someone become like that? How does spirituality become so natural that it no longer feels separate from life? That question intrigued me, long before romance entered the picture.
Was there a particular incident that had a strong impact on you?
Yes, actually, there were several. But one stands out. His father became ill. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough that he needed help for several weeks. And during that period, I watched Raghav rearrange his entire schedule. Work, social plans, personal commitments, everything. Without complaint, without resentment, without making himself the hero of the story. He simply did what needed to be done. Took his father to appointments, managed medications, helped around the house, checked in constantly. And one evening, I asked him, "How do you do all this without getting overwhelmed?" And his answer was incredibly simple. He said, "It is my duty." My duty. That's all. No grand speech, no self-congratulation, no moral performance. Just duty. And I remember realizing that I had spent years reading about Dharma, but this was the first time I had seen it operating naturally inside a human life.
What did that teach you about Dharma?
That Dharma isn't primarily about rules. That was a huge realization. Before studying Hindu traditions, I often assumed religion was mostly about beliefs and commandments. But gradually, I discovered something different. Dharma asks, what is being asked of you in this moment? What responsibilities belong to you? What obligations arise from your relationships? Your role? Your circumstances? And watching Raghav care for his father made me realize something. He wasn't helping because he expected a reward. He wasn't helping because someone would praise him. He wasn't helping because he feared punishment. He was helping because it was the right thing to do. Because love had responsibilities attached to it. That idea affected me deeply.
Did you talk about these things, or were you mostly observing?
Both. The observations came first, then the conversations. And the conversations were interesting because they were never debates. Never. Raghav wasn't trying to convert me. In fact, he almost never initiated theological discussions. Most of the time, I was the one asking questions. And what struck me was how comfortable he was saying, "I don't know." That surprised me, because I had grown up in environments where certainty was often prized. Answers were prized. Definitive conclusions were prized. But Raghav seemed comfortable with mystery, comfortable with complexity, comfortable with not having every answer. And somehow, that made his faith feel more authentic, not less.
Can you give an example?
One evening, we were discussing suffering, a topic I had struggled with for years. And I asked him, why do bad things happen to good people? The classic question, the question every religion has to confront. And instead of giving me a polished answer, he paused, thought for a moment, and said, I don't think human beings fully understand suffering. Then he talked about consequences, about growth, about uncertainty, about humility, about the limits of human knowledge. And I remember leaving that conversation feeling strangely relieved, not because he solved the problem, but because he didn't pretend to. There was honesty in that, a humility I found refreshing.
At what point did admiration become love?
Very slowly, almost imperceptibly. There wasn't a single moment. No dramatic realization, no cinematic scene. It happened through accumulation. Conversation after conversation, observation after observation. And eventually, I noticed something. When something interesting happened, he was the first person I wanted to tell. When I encountered a difficult question, he was the first person I wanted to ask. When I learned a new Sanskrit phrase, he was the first person I wanted to share it with. And that's when I realized something had changed, because he had quietly become part of my inner world, part of my intellectual life, part of my spiritual life, part of my emotional life, without either of us fully acknowledging it.
Did the two of you ever discuss your different backgrounds?
Frequently. And those conversations were some of the most important we ever had, because Raghav understood something that many people didn't. He understood that my journey wasn't simply toward Hinduism. It was also away from something, away from a worldview, away from an identity, away from a community, away from an entire way of understanding reality. And he never minimized that. Never. He never said, just let it go. He never said, why are you struggling? He understood that grief and transformation often happen together, and that understanding created a tremendous amount of trust.
Was there a moment when you realized your future might include him?
Yes, though it surprised me. One evening, after a festival, a group of us stayed behind helping clean up. Most people had already left. The temple was quiet. The lamps were still burning, the scent of incense lingered in the air. And I remember watching Raghav carefully extinguish some of the lamps and organize items that had been used during the celebration. Nothing extraordinary, just ordinary acts, done with care, done with attention, done with reverence. And suddenly a thought entered my mind, completely uninvited. I thought, if I ever build a life with someone, I hope it feels like this. Not excitement, not drama, not intensity. This. Steadiness. Meaning, reverence, purpose. And honestly, that realization startled me, because it wasn't a fantasy, it was a vision of the kind of life I wanted.
Did you tell him?
Absolutely not. Not then. I was still trying to understand my own feelings, and more importantly, I was still trying to understand myself, because by this point, something else was happening beneath the surface. The more I admired certain qualities in Raghav, the more I started asking why. Why did I find those qualities beautiful? Why did they move me so deeply? Why did they resonate with me? And eventually, I realized something. The qualities I admired most in him were the same qualities I wanted to cultivate in myself. Compassion, grace, patience, wisdom, gentleness, strength without aggression, devotion without fear, humility without weakness. And strangely enough, those were the same qualities I kept encountering in a name that had been quietly following me for years, a name hidden among the 1,000 names of the Divine Mother, a name I was getting closer and closer to admitting I loved.
Sarah, for several scenes now, you've been hinting at this mysterious name. First, you said it kept appearing in your studies. Then you said it followed you through your journey. Then you said it seemed connected to the qualities you most admired. And now you've told us that the same qualities you admired in Raghav was somehow connected to this name. So let's finally talk about it. What was happening?
I think I was going through a very strange period of self-examination, because after years of asking, what do I believe, I started asking a different question. What am I becoming? And honestly, that question was harder. Much harder. Beliefs can be debated. Ideas can be discussed. But becoming is personal. Painfully personal. Because it forces you to confront your weaknesses, your attachments, your fears, your habits, your blind spots. And by this point, Hinduism had changed the way I thought about spiritual life. I was no longer asking, am I saved? I was asking, what qualities am I cultivating? What kind of person am I becoming? And those questions led me into a deep period of reflection.
Reflection on what?
On the gap between who I was and who I wanted to become. Because one thing Hindu traditions did for me was expose my ego. Not destroy it overnight, but expose it. I started noticing how often I wanted recognition, how often I wanted validation, how often I wanted certainty, how often fear was quietly directing my decisions, how often anxiety was running beneath the surface of my life. And once you see those things, you can't unsee them. You begin looking inward differently. And during that period, I found myself returning again and again to the Lalita Sahasranamam.
Why the Lalita Sahasranamam specifically?
Because it seemed to contain an entire spiritual universe. Every time I listened to it, I discovered something new. Not merely theological ideas, qualities, virtues, ways of being, ways of relating to the divine, ways of relating to other people, ways of relating to oneself. And slowly, I began noticing something. There were certain names that affected me more than others, certain names that seemed to stop me in my tracks, certain names that felt less like descriptions of the divine and more like aspirations, qualities I longed to cultivate.
Can you give some examples?
Yes, many. I remember becoming fascinated by names associated with compassion, names associated with grace, names associated with wisdom, names associated with gentleness, names associated with beauty. I mean the kind of beauty that radiates from character, the kind of beauty you encounter in certain people, people whose presence makes others feel calm, safe, seen, loved, the kind of beauty that seems to come from alignment rather than appearance. That idea fascinated me because I had spent much of my life pursuing achievement, success, certainty, recognition. But now I found myself drawn toward entirely different qualities.
Was Raghav part of that realization?
Very much so. Because one of the things I admired most about him was that he wasn't trying to become impressive, he was trying to become good. And those are not the same thing. I think many people spend their lives trying to become impressive, successful, important, influential, recognized. But Raghav seemed focused on something else. Character. And being around him forced me to ask whether I was pursuing the right things. That question changed me.
So at this point, you're reflecting on the qualities you admire, the qualities you aspire to, and you're finding them reflected in the Lalita Sahasranamam. What happened next?
I started making lists. Actual lists. Not because I was looking for a new name. I need to emphasize that. At this stage, I still wasn't thinking about changing my name. I was trying to understand myself. Trying to understand what kind of person I wanted to become. And so I started writing down qualities that mattered to me. Compassion, wisdom, patience, grace, devotion, humility, strength, gentleness, truthfulness, inner peace. And then I began comparing those qualities to the things I was encountering in Hindu traditions, particularly in my relationship with the Divine Mother. And eventually, I realized something. The spiritual ideal that kept drawing me wasn't power. It wasn't status. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't victory. It was grace.
Grace? That's a very interesting choice.
It surprised me too. Because growing up Christian, grace was usually discussed in a theological sense. God's grace, salvation through grace, forgiveness through grace. Important ideas, beautiful ideas. But now I was encountering grace in a different way, as a quality of being. The ability to move through the world with kindness, with patience, with compassion, without constantly needing to dominate, control, or win. And I realized that was exactly what attracted me to both Raghav and the Divine Mother traditions. There was strength, but it wasn't harsh. There was wisdom, but it wasn't arrogant. There was power, but it wasn't domineering. That balance captivated me.
Was there a specific name from the Lalita Sahasranamam that first caught your attention?
Actually, several. For a while, I became fascinated with different names and what they represented. Some emphasized wisdom, others emphasized compassion, others emphasized beauty, others emphasized transcendence. And I spent months reflecting on them. Months. Because I wasn't choosing a label, I was contemplating an aspiration. An ideal, a direction, a way of being. And the deeper I went, the more one particular realization kept emerging. The qualities I admired most were not qualities of conquest. They were qualities of harmony, integration, balance, beauty, compassion, joy.
And eventually that brought you back to the name itself.
Yes, again and again, almost annoyingly, because I kept trying to move away from it, and somehow it kept returning. I would encounter it in commentary, then in chanting, then in conversation, then in devotional literature, then in temple discussions, and eventually I had to admit something. The reason it kept returning wasn't coincidence. The reason it kept returning was that it expressed something I was becoming, or perhaps something I hoped to become.
So what was it about that name? What made it different?
Because it brought everything together. The Sanskrit, the Divine Mother, the beauty of devotion, the idea that strength and gentleness can coexist, the idea that wisdom and compassion belong together, the idea that spirituality can be joyful rather than fearful, the idea that the divine can be approached through love rather than anxiety. All of those threads seemed to converge in one place. And eventually I realized that I wasn't merely attracted to the name, I was attracted to what it represented.
Did you tell anyone?
Not immediately. In fact, for a long time, I kept it completely private, because saying it out loud felt dangerous, too intimate, too revealing, almost like admitting a secret. Because by then, I knew something. If I ever embraced that name, it wouldn't merely be a name. It would be an admission that my journey had changed me more deeply than I had previously acknowledged. An admission that Hinduism was no longer something I studied, no longer something I practiced occasionally, no longer something I admired. It had become part of my identity, and that realization was frightening. Because once you accept a new identity, you cannot pretend to be who you used to be.
So when did you finally say it out loud? Not as a sacred name, but as yours.
That happened much later, and strangely enough, it happened because of Raghav. Not because he suggested it, not because he pressured me, not because he even knew what I was thinking. It happened because one day he asked me a simple question. A question so simple that it completely disarmed me. A question that forced me to confront who I was becoming. And once I answered it honestly, everything changed.
What was the question?
It was such an ordinary question. That's what makes it funny. There was nothing dramatic about it. No temple bells, no mystical experience, no great revelation. We were simply talking after a community event. People were cleaning up, putting things away. The evening was winding down, and we were discussing spiritual growth. The kind of conversation we often had. At one point, Raghav looked at me and asked, "Who do you hope to become?" That was it. Just, who do you hope to become? And for some reason, I couldn't answer. Not immediately. Not because I didn't understand the question, because I understood it too well.
Why was it difficult?
Because until then, I had spent years asking, what do I believe? What religion am I? What is true? What is false? What doctrine makes sense? Those questions had dominated my life, but suddenly I was being asked something deeper. Not what I believed, who I hoped to become. And that question bypassed theology entirely. It went straight to the heart, straight to identity, straight to aspiration. And I remember sitting there quietly, thinking, because the answer wasn't obvious. I found myself thinking about people I admired, people who seemed spiritually beautiful, people who radiated peace, people who radiated kindness, people who made others feel safe, people who made others feel seen, people whose presence calmed a room rather than dominating it, people who carried strength without harshness, wisdom without arrogance, devotion without fear. And as I reflected on those qualities, I realized something. Every single one of them reminded me of the same spiritual current I had been encountering for years. The current that first drew me toward the Divine Mother.
The same current that drew you toward the Lalita Sahasranamam?
Exactly. Because by this point, the Lalita Sahasranamam had become part of my life. I listened to it regularly. I tried chanting it every Friday. I studied it. I reflected on it. Sometimes I would simply sit quietly and let the names wash over me. And over time, I realized something. The text wasn't merely describing the divine. It was describing qualities I longed to cultivate, qualities I wanted to embody. Compassion, grace, joy, gentleness, wisdom, inner beauty, harmony, loving presence. The more I reflected, the more I realized those qualities were shaping my understanding of spirituality itself.
So how did that lead to the name?
Because eventually, I had to ask myself, if I could choose a spiritual ideal, what would it be? Not a profession, not a social identity, not a religious label. A spiritual ideal. Who would I want to become? And that question kept bringing me back to the same place. Not power, not certainty, not dominance, not recognition. Grace. Again and again, grace. The ability to move through the world with beauty, kindness, wisdom, and compassion. The ability to make people feel uplifted rather than diminished. The ability to bring harmony where there is conflict. The ability to remain gentle without becoming weak. The ability to remain strong without becoming hard. And the more I reflected on those qualities, the more one name kept returning.
Lalita.
Yes, Lalita.
What did that name mean to you?
Everything. And I don't say that lightly. Because at first, I thought I was attracted to the sound of the name. It is beautiful. But eventually, I realized it wasn't the sound. It was the meaning. In the tradition surrounding Lalita Mata, I encountered something extraordinary. Beauty without vanity. Power without aggression. Wisdom without arrogance. Love without possessiveness. Joy without superficiality. There was a wholeness there. A balance. A harmony. And that harmony felt like the opposite of how I had spent much of my life. For years I had been anxious, restless, searching, trying to control outcomes, trying to force certainty, trying to solve everything. But the more I encountered the vision represented by Lalita Mata, the more I felt drawn toward a different way of being. A softer way. Not weaker, softer. More integrated, more peaceful, more aligned. And I realized that was the person I wanted to become.
Was there a specific moment when you knew?
Yes, though it wasn't dramatic. One Friday evening, I was chanting the Lalita Sahasranamam. A lamp was burning, the house was quiet, and I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, gratitude for the people who had guided me, gratitude for the traditions I had encountered, gratitude for the questions that had led me here. And suddenly, a thought appeared. Not a command, not a revelation, a realization. I realized that every major turning point in my spiritual journey seemed to converge on the same place. The Divine Mother, the Lalita Sahasranamam, the aspiration toward grace, the aspiration toward beauty of character, the aspiration toward compassionate strength. And in that moment, I understood why the name had followed me for so long. It wasn't following me. It was waiting for me.
Did you tell Raghav?
Eventually. And I was terrified, because saying it out loud felt incredibly vulnerable. A name isn't just a word. A name can be a declaration of who you are, or who you hope to become. And when I finally told him that I felt drawn to the name Lalita, he was quiet for a moment. Very quiet. Then he smiled and asked, "Do you know why that name keeps returning?"
What did you say?
I said, "No." And he answered, "Because you're already moving toward it." I'll never forget that. Because he wasn't talking about labels. He wasn't talking about religion. He was talking about character. He was saying that the qualities I admired were already reshaping me, that my life was already moving in that direction. And hearing that from him affected me deeply.
So was that the moment you became Lalita?
No, not yet. That came later, because choosing a name is one thing, living up to it is another. And before I could fully embrace that identity, another question had to be answered. A much larger question. Not who I hoped to become, but who I hoped to become beside. Because by this point, something else had become impossible to ignore. My feelings for Raghav. And eventually, both of us would have to stop pretending that those feelings weren't there.
Sarah, by this point in the story, you've told us about your journey into Hinduism. You've told us about Sanskrit, about the Divine Mother, about the Lalita Sahasranamam, about the name that eventually became part of your identity. And you've told us about Raghav. But eventually there came a moment when all of those threads had to come together. Not in theory, not in discussion, in real life. So let me ask the obvious question. When did the two of you finally stop pretending that you were just friends?
Probably long after everyone else had figured it out. I think everyone around us knew before we did. Or at least before we admitted it, because by then we had spent years talking, learning, growing, asking questions together, sharing experiences together. And somewhere along the way, friendship had quietly become something deeper. Not suddenly, not dramatically, naturally, almost inevitably.
Who said it first?
If you ask Raghav, he will be polite and say he did, to save me any embarrassment. But the truth is, I did. One evening, the conversation wandered from philosophy to family and the future. We talked about a life centered on parivar, on Dharma, on service, on spiritual growth, on community, on responsibility, not perfection, meaning. As we talked, it finally dawned on me. I just couldn't imagine my life without him. And to this day, it remains one of the most frightening things I have ever done. Because by then, I knew the answer mattered. I remember saying something like, "Can I ask you a strange question?" And he smiled and said, "Probably." And then I asked, "If you were to choose someone to build a life with..." I paused, took a breath, and just blurted it out. "Would you consider building that life with me?"
You proposed. How did he respond?
He said nothing for several seconds, which was absolutely terrifying. Then he looked down, shook his head slightly, and started laughing. Not because he was rejecting me, because apparently he had been trying to figure out how to ask me the exact same question for months. And then he said something I will never forget. He said, "I was beginning to think you would never ask." And I started crying.
Did you tell your parents?
Yes, Raghav insisted on it. He approached relationships the same way he approached everything else. Seriously, thoughtfully, responsibly. And one of the first things he said was something I'll never forget. He said, "If we're going to do this, we need to be honest with our families." That was his instinct. Not secrecy, not convenience, family. And hearing that made me respect him even more.
How did they react?
Not well. And I don't say that with anger. I understand why it was difficult for them. From their perspective, their daughter wasn't simply marrying someone, she had changed religions, changed beliefs, changed her worldview. And now she wanted a Hindu marriage. That was a lot, a tremendous amount. For years they had hoped I would eventually return to Christianity, and now they were being confronted with the reality that my journey had taken me somewhere else entirely. So, yes, there were difficult conversations. Painful conversations. Many conversations.
Did Raghav try to win them over?
Very much so. And that's one reason I respected him. He never treated my family as obstacles. Never. He treated them as people deserving respect. He answered questions. He listened. He gave them time. He tried to understand their concerns. And for a long time, both of us hoped they would eventually support the marriage. Or at least attend. But unfortunately, that didn't happen.
Was that heartbreaking?
Yes, very. Because no daughter dreams of getting married without her parents present. At least I didn't. There was grief in that. Real grief. And even now it's difficult to talk about. But eventually I had to accept something. My parents loved me. I loved them. But love does not always produce agreement. Sometimes people arrive at different conclusions. And that was one of those situations.
So how did Madurai enter the story?
Through Raghav's family. One of his uncles lived there. It felt natural. I should probably mention something here. Raghav came from a Tamil Brahmin family. His family had been in America for many years, but they carried their traditions with them. Festivals, rituals, Sanskrit recitation, family customs, respect for elders, all of it. And when we started discussing marriage, Madurai kept emerging as the obvious choice, because that was where much of his extended family still lived.
What was it like arriving there?
Overwhelming. In the best possible way. I had spent years studying Hindu civilization. Years. Reading texts, learning Sanskrit, visiting temples, listening to chants. But suddenly, I wasn't studying it anymore. I was standing inside it. I remember stepping out into the heat, hearing Tamil all around me, watching families carrying flowers, hearing temple bells in the distance, seeing shrines tucked into ordinary streets, and realizing that I was standing inside one of the world's oldest, continuously living sacred cultures. That feeling is difficult to describe. It felt simultaneously foreign and strangely familiar, as though I had been walking toward that place for years without realizing it.
And then came the wedding.
Yes, and before the wedding, something important happened, something I had been quietly moving toward for years. My name.
This is when Sarah officially became Lalita.
Yes, not because I was marrying an Indian man, not because anyone pressured me, not because someone told me I had to. That distinction matters, because the journey toward that name had begun years earlier, long before wedding plans, long before Madurai, long before marriage. The name emerged from my relationship with the Divine Mother, from the Lalita Sahasranamam, from the qualities I hoped to cultivate, and before the wedding ceremonies began, I formally embraced it. For the first time, I publicly accepted the name Lalita, and I remember feeling strangely peaceful, not because I was becoming someone else, because I was finally acknowledging who I had become.
What was that moment like?
Profoundly emotional, because names carry stories. And suddenly, the story wasn't theoretical anymore. The transformation had become visible, public, real. I remember hearing people address me as Lalita, and instead of feeling strange, it felt natural, as though the name had been waiting patiently for me to catch up.
Then came the wedding itself.
Yes, and honestly, nothing could have prepared me for it. Because growing up in America, I thought weddings were primarily about romance. The Hindu wedding taught me something different. It taught me that marriage is about partnership, shared responsibility, shared purpose, shared spiritual growth. And every part of the ceremony reflected that.
Was there a particular moment that affected you?
Several, but one stands out, the Kanyadan, because by then it was clear my father would not be there, and that was painful, very painful. But one of Raghav's uncles quietly stepped forward, not to replace my father, no one could do that, but to ensure I would not stand alone. And I'll never forget that kindness, because in that moment, I felt both loss and acceptance, grief and gratitude at the same time.
What about the rest of the ceremony?
Everything felt meaningful. The mantra, the sacred fire, the presence of family, the sense of continuity, the awareness that these rituals had been performed for generations. At one point, the priest recited family lineages and references, and I remember realizing that this ceremony wasn't simply joining two individuals. It was connecting two histories, two families, two journeys.
And the moment everyone remembers? The Mangalya Dharanam?
Beautiful. That mantra I knew well. I cried when it was recited as Raghav tied the Mangal Sutra around my neck. People thought I cried because I was missing my family. I did, but I cried because Raghav was literally saying that he was tying the Mangal Sutra around my neck for the sake of his life. And then the moment that affected me even more came afterward. The Saptapadi, the 7 steps. Because those steps revealed what marriage actually meant. Not merely love, commitment, responsibility, mutual support, shared purpose, shared growth, shared duty. I remember listening carefully to the vows and realizing something. We weren't promising to feel a certain way forever. We were promising to walk together, through prosperity, through hardship, through family, through service, through spiritual growth. That felt incredibly mature and incredibly sacred.
Was there a moment when it all became real?
Yes, after the wedding, when we went to seek blessings.
At the Meenakshi temple?
Yes, the next day we visited the magnificent temple. And honestly, that may have been the most emotional moment of the entire trip. Because for years, the Divine Mother had been quietly guiding my journey. Through questions, through study, through Sanskrit, through devotion, through the Lalita Sahasranamam. And now I was standing before Meenakshi Amman as a married woman, as Lalita Iyer, beside my husband. And I remember looking around the temple and thinking, how did I get here? A girl from Houston, raised Christian, standing before one of the great temples of the Divine Mother. The journey felt impossible, and yet there I was.
What did you pray for?
For Raghav's health. I also prayed for wisdom, for humility, for the strength to live up to the path I had chosen, for the ability to become worthy of the name I had embraced, and for the life that Raghav and I were beginning together. Because standing there, I realized something. The wedding wasn't the end of my journey. It was the beginning of a new one, and the hardest part of that journey still lay ahead.
Because eventually, I would have to return home and finally face the people whose reactions I had been dreading for years. My family.
Before we go there, can I stop calling you Sarah? I had to work very hard to not slip up before. So tell me, Lalita, what happened when you came home?
Sarah feels alien to me now, so please address me as Lalita. On our return, life continued. The wedding was over. I was married. I was Lalita Iyer. My parents still loved me. I still loved them. They still disagreed with me. I still disagreed with them. And in many ways, that remains true today. I think my parents still hope that one day I will return to Christianity. And if I'm being honest, I think they probably still hope that Raghav will convert too. That hope has never completely disappeared. Maybe it never will. And I understand why. Because if you genuinely believe Christianity is true, then from your perspective, that hope comes from love. Not malice, not control, love. So over time, we learned something. We learned that agreement and love are not the same thing. We stopped trying to resolve every disagreement. We stopped trying to win every argument. And instead, we learned how to remain family, even while walking different paths. And honestly, I think that is one of the most important lessons I learned from this entire journey.
Well, Lalita, we've spent almost this entire interview talking about the journey, the questions, the searching, the doubts, the discoveries, the temples, the Sanskrit, the Divine Mother, Raghav, Madurai, marriage. But eventually, every story arrives at the same place, ordinary life. So let me ask a very simple question. What does life look like now? What does it actually mean to live as a Hindu? Besides wearing beautiful traditional Indian jewelry and clothes. Love the bindi and mangtikka, by the way, and the clever way you have concealed the Mangal Sutra behind the beautiful necklace for dramatic effect.
Thank you! The jewelry is a gift from my husband's family, so I wanted to wear it here. But I don't remove the Mangal Sutra ever, no matter what other jewelry I wear. It's sacred for me. But to get back to your question, life is much quieter than people imagine. I think when people hear religious conversion, they imagine some dramatic transformation, as though every day suddenly becomes mystical. But most of life remains ordinary. I still wake up, I still go to work, I still pay bills, I still worry about family, I still deal with stress, I still make mistakes. The difference is not that life became extraordinary. The difference is that ordinary life became sacred. And that has changed everything.
What do you mean by that?
Growing up, spirituality often felt compartmentalized. There was church, there was prayer, there was worship, and then there was everything else. Now those boundaries feel much softer. Because Hindu traditions constantly remind me that the sacred can exist everywhere. In the home, in relationships, in food, in work, in service, in study, in nature, in daily life. That shift has been profound. Because spirituality is no longer something I visit, it is something I try to inhabit.
What does a normal day look like?
The day usually begins early and quietly, before checking my phone, before looking at email, before any of the noise begins. I shower. That is my husband's family tradition. Now it is part of my routine as well, and I enjoy it. Then I light a small lamp, offer flowers and a simple prayer to Ganeshji, Shivji. Each day, we pay attention to one aspect of the divine. For example, Mondays are special for Shivji, and both Raghav and I fast as a couple. On Fridays, I recite Lalita Sahasranamam. Daily practice changes the entire tone of the day, because the first thing I do each morning is remember that life is larger than my immediate concerns, larger than my anxieties, larger than my ambitions, larger than my fears. And that perspective matters.
Do you still study?
Constantly. In fact, more than ever. One of the things I love about Hindu traditions is that learning never really ends. There is always another text, another commentary, another interpretation, another question. I still read the Bhagavad Gita regularly. I still study Sanskrit. I still explore different traditions. I still listen to lectures. And one of the things I appreciate most is that inquiry is encouraged. Questions are not viewed as threats. Questions are part of the journey. That intellectual openness continues to inspire me.
Do you study the Lalita Sahasranamam primarily on Fridays?
No. I chant it on Fridays but hear it every day. It has become part of the rhythm of my life. Sometimes while driving, sometimes while cooking, sometimes during prayer,
sometimes simply because hearing it brings me peace. And even now, after all these years, certain names still stop me. Certain names still make me pause and reflect. The text continues to unfold, continues to teach, continues to inspire. In many ways, it feels less like something I listen to and more like something I live with.
What role does the temple play now?
A very important one, though perhaps not in the way people expect. One thing that took me years to understand is that a mandir is not simply a place where people gather. It is a devalaya, the home of the divine. That distinction matters. When I walk into a mandir, I am not attending an event. I am entering sacred space, seeking darshan, offering gratitude, participating in a living tradition. And every time I hear the bells, every time I witness arti, every time I receive prasad, I am reminded of the continuity of that tradition. Generations before me did these same things. Generations after me hopefully will as well. That sense of continuity is deeply moving.
What about festivals?
I love them. Absolutely love them. Because festivals reveal something beautiful about Hindu civilization. They are not merely commemorations. They are participation, living participation. Whether it is Navaratri, Deepavali, Ram Navami, Krishna Janmastami, or Shivaratri, each festival invites you into a different relationship with the sacred. And what I love most is that entire families participate. Children, parents, grandparents, everyone. Tradition becomes something lived rather than merely remembered. And that has been one of the great joys of my life.
What has marriage added to all of this?
A companion. And I don't mean that lightly. One of the things I appreciate most about being married to Raghav is that we are walking the same path. Not identically. We have different strengths, different interests, different perspectives. But we share the same foundation, the same commitment, the same desire for spiritual growth, the same understanding that marriage is not merely about happiness. It is about helping each other become better human beings. And that perspective has enriched my life enormously.
After becoming Hindu, has anything continued to surprise you?
Yes, the depth, the sheer depth. When I first encountered Hindu traditions, I thought I was exploring a religion. What I eventually discovered was a civilization, a vast conversation stretching across thousands of years. Philosophy, poetry, ritual, music, art, ethics, metaphysics, devotion, psychology, all woven together. And even now, I feel like a beginner. There is always more to learn, more to understand, more to contemplate. That humility has been good for me, because it reminds me that spiritual growth is not a destination. It is a lifelong process.
So after everything we've discussed, the years of searching, the questions, the sacrifices, the difficult conversations, the changes, the grief, the joy, was it worth it?
Yes, without hesitation. Yes. Not because the journey was easy, it wasn't. Not because every question was answered, they weren't. Not because every relationship remained unchanged, they didn't. But because I followed truth as honestly as I could. And when I look back now, I feel something I rarely felt when I was younger. Alignment. My beliefs, my practices, my values, my daily life, my understanding of the divine. They all move in the same direction. And that has brought a deep sense of peace. Not perfection, peace. And honestly, that is more than I ever expected to find.
Lalita, we've spent hours talking about your journey. Houston, Christianity, Neo Paganism, yoga, Sanskrit, the Bhagavad Gita, the Divine Mother, the Lalita Sahasranamam, Raghav, Madurai, marriage, life as a Hindu. And now we've arrived at the final question. Many of the people listening to this interview will be Christians. Some will be curious, some will be confused, some may be concerned, some may even be upset. So if you could speak directly to them, what would you say?
The first thing I would say is, please listen before you judge. That may sound simple, but it matters. Because for many years, I held opinions about Hinduism that were based almost entirely on things I had heard from other people. Not things I had studied myself, not things I had experienced myself, not things I had investigated honestly. And looking back, I realize how unfair that was. Because no tradition deserves to be judged solely through caricatures. especially a tradition that has shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people for thousands of years.
What do you think Christians misunderstand most often?
Probably that Hindus are worshipping many gods in the simplistic way it is often described.
That was certainly my assumption growing up. I imagined Hinduism as a collection of disconnected deities competing with one another. The reality was far more sophisticated. What I encountered was a tradition wrestling with profound questions about the nature of ultimate reality. Questions about consciousness, questions about existence, questions about the relationship between the individual soul and the divine. Questions that had occupied some of humanity's greatest thinkers for centuries. Whether someone ultimately agrees with Hindu philosophy or not, it deserves to be understood on its own terms, not through stereotypes.
Anything else?
Yes. The assumption that Hindus are somehow less devoted than Christians, that one surprised me enormously, because after spending years in temples and Hindu communities, I encountered extraordinary devotion, extraordinary discipline, extraordinary commitment, people waking before sunrise for prayer, people memorizing vast amounts of sacred literature, people organizing their lives around service, people practicing generosity quietly and consistently, people maintaining traditions across generations. You may disagree with our theology, just as we disagree with yours, but it is impossible to honestly deny our sincerity. And I think recognizing that sincerity is important.
Do you regret your Christian upbringing?
No, not at all. And that's important for me to say, because people often assume that conversion requires bitterness. It doesn't. My Christian upbringing shaped me in many positive ways. It taught me compassion, it taught me service, it taught me sincerity. It introduced me to spiritual questions that eventually led me much further. I am grateful for many parts of it, very grateful. My journey was not a rejection of everything I came from, it was an expansion beyond it. At least, that is how it feels to me.
Do you still respect Jesus?
Absolutely. And I know that answer surprises some people. But yes, I still respect Jesus deeply. I still think he was one of history's great spiritual teachers. I still find wisdom in many of his teachings. I still admire his compassion, his courage, his willingness to challenge hypocrisy. None of that disappeared. What changed was my understanding of who he was, and my understanding of what spiritual truth requires. Those are different things.
If a Christian watching this interview says, Lalita, I think you're wrong, what would you say?
I would say, thank you for being honest. And I mean that sincerely, because disagreement is not the problem. Human beings have disagreed about spiritual questions for thousands of years. The problem is when disagreement becomes contempt, when disagreement becomes dehumanization, when disagreement becomes the assumption that sincere people cannot arrive at different conclusions. I spent years trying to understand Christianity honestly. All I ask is that Christians extend the same courtesy toward Hindu traditions. Study them. Read them, talk to practitioners, visit a temple, ask questions, then make your decision, but make it from knowledge rather than assumption.
Do you hope Christians become Hindu?
Hey, Ram.
No. And that answer surprises people too. Mata put you in a Christian mother's womb or turned you Christian because that is necessary for your Atma's spiritual journey. Who am I to second-guess that? I am not interested in recruiting anyone. I am not interested in winning arguments. I am not interested in defeating Christianity. My journey was personal, deeply personal. What I hope is something much simpler. I hope people pursue truth honestly. I hope people examine their assumptions. I hope people remain open to learning. And I hope people treat one another with dignity, even when they disagree. If someone does that and remains Christian, I respect that. If someone does that and arrives somewhere else, I respect that too.
After everything we've discussed, how would you summarize what Hinduism gave you?
Perspective, humility, peace, a sense of belonging, a relationship with the divine that feels expansive rather than restrictive, a framework for understanding life that feels coherent to me, an appreciation for the sacredness of existence, a deeper sense of responsibility for my own growth, and perhaps most importantly, it gave me permission to continue asking questions. That may sound strange, but it matters, because I spent much of my life searching, and Hindu traditions never asked me to stop searching. They invited me to search more deeply. That invitation changed my life.
Last question. If the young woman from Houston, the young Christian girl you once were, was sitting across from you right now, what would you tell her?
I would tell her not to be afraid. Not to be afraid of questions. Not to be afraid of uncertainty. Not to be afraid of learning. Not to be afraid of changing her mind. Not to be afraid of where an honest search for truth might lead. Because for many years, I thought faith meant protecting myself from difficult questions. What I eventually learned was that faith sometimes means having the courage to ask them. And if I could tell her one final thing, it would be this. The path will be longer than you imagine, more difficult than you imagine, and far more beautiful than you imagine. There will be moments of confusion, moments of grief, moments when you feel completely lost. Keep going, keep learning, keep listening, keep searching, because one day, years from now, you will look back and realize that every question mattered, every step mattered, every struggle mattered, and you will discover that what felt like wandering was actually a journey home.
Lalita, thank you, not only for sharing your story, but for sharing it with honesty. It has been an extraordinary conversation. Please keep in touch. Namaste.
Nandri Malini. I want to end with a small chant. Ya Devi Sarvabhuteshu Matra Rupena Samstita Namastasyai 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 Namo Namaha. To the goddess who lives in every heart as the mother, I offer my reverence to her again and again. And if my story helps even one person approach another tradition with greater understanding, then sharing it was worth it. Because whatever else our spiritual journeys may be, they should make us more truthful, more compassionate, and more human. And that, I think, is something we can all agree on.